They say confession cleanses the soul. I do not believe this anymore. I have spoken my sins to chaplains who smell of incense and old blood. I have whispered my doubts to inquisitors who smile with too many teeth. I have screamed my regrets into the void between stars, where no one listens and nothing answers. And yet the weight remains, crushing and absolute, a burden measured not in kilograms but in the millions of lives I have taken in the Emperor's name. My name, if I ever truly had one, is lost to me now. The records call me Subject Designate Sigma 7, the Exemplar, the Frozen Sentinel, though these are titles, not names. Names are for people. I am not sure I qualify anymore. I write this not for absolution, for there is none to be found in this galaxy. I write this because somewhere, buried beneath the ceramite and the conditioning and the centuries of unending war, there remains a fragment of what I was. A ghost that remembers believing in something beyond survival. A fool who thought ideals mattered more than ammunition counts. This is my testimony. This is my confession. This is the chronicle of how the Imperium takes even its weapons and grinds them to dust. The Emperor protects, they tell me. He does not. The first thing I remember, truly remember, is the smell. Burning promethium, charred flesh. The acrid chemical stink of mass cremation mixed with the cloying sweetness of decay. It filled my nostrils, thick and inescapable, as consciousness dragged me up from the darkness like a corpse pulled from deep water. My lungs seized, rejecting air that tasted of industry and death. I opened my eyes to a sky the color of infected wounds. Above me, the heavens churned with pollution so dense it had strangled the sun to a dim red coal barely visible through the toxic clouds. Ash fell like snow, endless and gray, settling on my face with the gentleness of a funeral shroud. In the distance, I could hear the screaming, not the sharp, sudden cries of immediate pain, but the sustained howling of millions in perpetual agony. It was the sound of a world dying, and it never stopped. On your feet, soldier. The voice cut through the sensory assault with the precision of a surgical blade. I turned my head. The movement felt wrong, too powerful. Like my neck was made of coiled steel rather than flesh, and saw him. A man in a long coat the color of storm clouds, face hidden behind a rebreather mask. One hand resting on the grip of a bolt pistol that looked more like an execution device than a sidearm. I said, on your feet. The Emperor's time is precious, and you're wasting it. I stood. The motion was instinctive, automatic, and completely alien. My body responded before my mind could process the command, muscles firing with mechanical efficiency. I rose to my full height and kept rising. I was taller than I remembered, broader, heavier. My hands, when I looked at them, were wrapped in armor that gleamed dully in the poisoned light. Ceramite, my mind supplied, though I didn't know how I knew the word. Where? My voice emerged as a rasp, underused and harsh. Where am I? Hive Primaris Exterior Defense Trench Network, Subsector Gamma 9, Forge World Metallica Adjacent Territory. The man recited the location like a shipping manifest. You are currently standing in what used to be Manufactorum Complex 447 Alpha before the Greenskin incursion. 15 billion workers died here in the first 3 days of the assault. The Departamento Munitorum considers this an acceptable loss ratio. I stared at him, trying to process numbers that large. 15 billion. The entire population of... The thought slipped away like water through fingers. I couldn't remember what I was trying to remember. There was something before this, something cold and quiet, something that felt like peace. Ice. I remembered ice. And then nothing. And then this hell of ash and screaming. I don't understand, I managed. Who am I? How did I... You are Subject Designate Sigma 7. Recently recovered from a derelict vessel designated Frozen Liberty, drifting coordinates classified, believed to be of pre-imperial origin. The man spoke without inflection, reading from a data slate he'd produced from his coat. Preliminary genetic analysis indicates augmentation of unknown pattern, exceeding standard Astartes baseline in several metrics but lacking black carapace integration. Neural architecture suggests prolonged stasis exposure, minimum estimate 4,000 to 6,000 years. Memory engrams corrupted but recoverable. Current designation, warp-touched xenotech of probable human origin, pending inquisitorial review. The words were gibberish: Astartes, black carapace, warp-touched. None of it meant anything, yet all of it felt heavy with dreadful significance. I struggled for the words. I need to know what happened. What you need, the man interrupted, his voice hardening, is irrelevant. What the Imperium needs is relevant. You have been assessed, processed, and conscripted into the service of the God Emperor of mankind. Your past is gone. Your future is measured in how efficiently you kill his enemies before you die. These are the only truths that matter. He gestured with his bolt pistol, and I saw them for the first time. The soldiers. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, stretching back into the ash-choked distance. They wore uniforms that might once have been clean but were now the universal brown-gray of mud and blood. Their eyes were hollow, their faces gaunt, and every single one of them looked simultaneously too old and too young, as if the concept of appropriate aging had been abandoned in favor of pure survival. Fall in, Sigma 7. The enemy advances and we require your strength. Wait, I said, and the desperation in my own voice startled me. Please, just tell me my name, my real name. The man was silent for a long moment, the only sound the distant screaming and the crunch of ash beneath our boots. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something that might have been pity, though it was hard to tell through the rebreather's mechanical filter. You don't have one anymore, he said. None of us do. We're ammunition, soldier. Ammunition doesn't need names. They gave me a shield. It was massive, easily as tall as I was, forged from layered ceramite and plasteel and emblazoned with a symbol I didn't recognize, a two-headed eagle. Wings spread in defiance or desperation, I couldn't tell which. The Aquila, they called it, the symbol of the Imperium, the symbol of everything they expected me to die for. The Emperor protects, the armorer intoned as he maglocked it to my left arm. The weight was immense, but my enhanced body bore it without strain. Through faith and fury, through steel and sacrifice, the Emperor protects. What am I protecting? I asked. The armorer looked at me as if I'd asked what color the sky was before pollution had murdered it. Humanity, he said simply. What's left of it? The briefing was conducted in a crater that had once been a cathedral. I could tell because fragments of stained glass still littered the ground, crunching beneath our boots as we assembled. The man in the storm-gray coat, Commissar Harkin, I'd learned, though learning his name made him no less terrifying, stood before a hololithic display that flickered and sparked, its generator dying but not yet permitted to fail. The enemy, he began without preamble, is a Wa of unknown designation, estimated strength between 15 and 20 million combatants. Greenskins, orcs for those of you too ignorant to know the proper low Gothic terminology. The hololithic sputtered to life, showing creatures that defied sanity. They were massive, green-skinned, brutish things that looked like violence given flesh. Their weapons were scrap metal welded into vaguely gun-shaped configurations, and they wore armor that appeared to be held together by faith in their own invincibility. They have breached the lower manufactorums and are advancing toward the primary Hive spire, Harkin continued. If they reach the geothermal generators, this world dies. 18 billion souls reside in the upper Hive. Acceptable losses are calculated at 14 billion if we can maintain the generator complex. 14 billion. Acceptable. I wanted to vomit, but my enhanced body wouldn't permit it. Nausea was a luxury I'd apparently been engineered out of. Our objective is to hold Transit Corridor Epsilon for 72 hours while reinforcements are redirected from the Theta front. We have been assigned 3,000 penal legionnaires, 200 standard guard infantry, 15 heavy weapons teams, and 1 enhanced asset. Harkin's gaze fixed on me. You, Sigma 7, you will lead the penal legion into the manufactorum depths. You will kill everything that moves and isn't human. You will not retreat. You will not surrender. You will die if necessary, but you will hold that corridor. And if I refuse? The words left my mouth before I could stop them. The bolt pistol was aimed at my head before I finished speaking. Then you die here, Harkin said calmly, and I conscript your enhanced organs for servitor production. Your choice takes approximately 3 seconds. I looked around at the soldiers, the hollow-eyed children conscripted too young, the old men who'd survived too long, the criminals and the faithful and the desperate, all pressed into service because the Imperium's hunger for bodies never ended. They watched me with the flat affect of people who'd seen this scene before and knew how it ended. I lowered my eyes. I'll go, I said. Excellent, Harkin replied, holstering his weapon. The Emperor protects. Dismissed. They gave me the Penal Legion at dawn, if dawn existed on a world where the sun had been murdered by industry. 3,000 men and women whose crimes ranged from theft to heresy, to simply being in the wrong place when the Departamento Munitorum needed to meet its conscription quota. They wore prisoner fatigues dyed red so their blood wouldn't show as clearly, and explosive collars that would detonate if they retreated beyond a certain range of the front line. These are your soldiers, Harkin informed me, handing me a detonator control that felt like a snake in my palm. They are expendable. You are not. Use them accordingly. I looked at the faces before me. So young, so old, so tired, and felt something crack inside my chest. What if I refuse to activate the collars? I asked quietly. Then I activate them remotely, Harkin replied, and you watch 3,000 people die in 6 seconds. Then I give you 3,000 more and we repeat this conversation until you understand that mercy is a luxury the Imperium cannot afford. He walked away, leaving me alone with my army of the damned. I wanted to say something inspiring, some speech about duty and honor and the value of their lives. But when I opened my mouth, all that came out was, "Stay close to me, I'll try to keep you alive." A woman in the front row, she couldn't have been more than 17, with scars on her wrists that spoke of suicide attempts, laughed. It was the saddest sound I'd ever heard. "No one keeps us alive, Exemplar," she said. "We're ammunition. We're just hoping to kill something before we're spent." The manufactorum depths were a vision of hell rendered in industrial Gothic. Pipes the size of buildings stretched into darkness, leaking steam and chemicals that burned exposed skin. The air was so hot it felt solid, and the noise, the endless mechanical grinding, was loud enough to damage unprotected hearing. Somewhere in this labyrinth of steel and suffering, the orcs waited. We descended in silence, 3,000 condemned souls and 1 enhanced weapon into the dark. The first orc I killed died without understanding what hit it. I saw it emerge from behind a rusted fuel tank, massive and brutal and laughing with the joy of violence, and I moved without thinking. My shield caught it in the chest with the force of a runaway cargo hauler. Bone shattered, green flesh pulped. The creature died with its grin still frozen on its face. The second one I killed with my fists, driving augmented knuckles through its skull with such force that its brain matter sprayed across the nearest wall. The third, fourth, and fifth came as a group. My shield became a bludgeon, a blade, a wall of death that crushed everything it touched. Behind me, the penal legion fought with the desperate ferocity of people who knew they were already dead. Lost fire lit the darkness in strobing red flashes. Crude orc weapons roared their defiance. Bodies fell, green and human alike, until the floor was slick with blood of multiple colors. We fought for 3 days in that hell. I lost count of how many I killed, hundreds, maybe thousands. My shield became caked with gore, the aquila obscured by layers of violence. My armor, once gleaming, turned the color of old rust and dried blood. And I learned that the orcs felt no fear, only joy in battle. I learned that the penal legionnaires fought hardest when they had nothing left to lose. I learned that Commissar Harkin was watching from somewhere behind us, ready to detonate collars if anyone broke. And I learned that I was very, very good at killing. On the 4th day, we emerged from the manufactorum into weak, poisoned sunlight. Of the 3,000 souls who'd descended with me, 247 survived. The orcs were broken, scattered, their advance halted. Commissar Harkin met us at the exit. He reviewed the casualty reports on his data slate, nodded once, and spoke the words that would haunt me. Acceptable losses. The Emperor protects. Sigma 7. Report for debrief and reassignment in 6 hours. Your service is noted. He walked away. I stood among the survivors, the wounded, the traumatized, the ones who'd somehow endured, and waited for someone to say it had mattered, that their sacrifice had meaning, that the price paid had purchased something worth having. No one said anything. We were ammunition, after all. And ammunition doesn't get thanked when it's spent. They didn't let me rest. 6 hours after crawling from the manufactorum depths, still stinking of cordite and orc blood, I was loaded onto a transport that looked like a flying coffin and shipped off-world. No explanation, no debriefing, just a loading manifest that listed me between ammunition crates and ration packs, as if there was no meaningful distinction. The journey took 3 weeks through the warp, that screaming hell space between stars that I didn't understand but instinctively feared. The other passengers were criminals being shipped to penal worlds, their eyes dead long before their bodies would follow. They didn't speak to me. I didn't speak to them. We simply existed in that flying tomb, counting the hours until destination or death, whichever came first. When we finally arrived, the planet below looked clean, disturbingly so. Gone were the ash clouds and the screaming. The world that filled the viewport was gray stone and ordered courtyards, massive fortress monasteries that sprawled across continents like geometric prayers to efficiency. The Scola Progenium, the shuttle pilot informed me, where the Imperium made its faithful servants, where they would remake me. The drill abbot who met me at the landing platform was a grotesque fusion of faith and machinery. Half his skull had been replaced with augmetic components that clicked and whirred with each movement. One eye a glowing red lens that never blinked. His remaining organic parts looked mummified, skin stretched tight over bones that should have broken under the weight of the power armor he wore. A shock maul hung from his belt, its activation stud worn smooth by centuries of use. Subject designate Sigma 7, he intoned, his voice processed through a Vox grill that made it sound like grinding gears. You have been requisitioned for accelerated indoctrination and theological compliance conditioning. You will address me as Drill Abbot Mordax. You will obey without question. You will learn without hesitation. You will believe without doubt. These are not requests. I don't understand, I said. I fought. I held the line. I did what was asked. The shock maul took me in the ribs before I finished the sentence. Pain exploded through my enhanced body with an intensity that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to primal agony. I dropped to one knee, gasping, and Mordax leaned in close enough that I could smell the sacred oils they used to lubricate his augmetics. "You fought adequately," he said, "but you fought with doubt in your heart." Commissar Harkin noted 17 instances of hesitation, 9 occasions of questioning orders, and 3 moments of what he termed dangerous compassion. These are diseases, Sigma 7. Cancers of thought that, left untreated, could spread to those around you. "We will cut them out. We will burn them away. We will remake you into something pure." He straightened, and I saw them behind him, the other inductees, children mostly. Orphans of Imperial servants taken young so the Imperium could mold them before dangerous concepts like choice or freedom could take root. They watched my humiliation with the blank expressions of those who'd learned that emotion was weakness, that questions led to pain, that faith was the only shield against the galaxy's infinite cruelty. "Stand," Mordax commanded. I stood. "Now we begin." The first week they broke my body, not through combat or labor, but through ritual. I was stripped, cleansed with waters blessed by priests whose names I never learned, and dressed in rough gray robes that chafed against skin used to armor. Then they made me kneel on cold stone for 16 hours a day while Mordax and his subordinates lectured on the glory of the God Emperor. "In the beginning," Mordax would intone, his augmetic voice echoing through the prayer hall, "there was darkness. Humanity crawled through old nights, scattered and dying until he came, the master of mankind, the Emperor Ascendant, he who would unite the species and lead them to dominion over the stars." My knees bled. The stone was designed for that, rough enough to tear skin but not so severe as to cause permanent damage. Pain without crippling, suffering with function. But humanity failed him, Mordax continued. Through pride and weakness, through the corruption of his most favored son, the Imperium fell into darkness. 10,000 years he has sat upon the golden throne sustained by sacrifice, protecting us from the predations of chaos. 10,000 years of endless war because we failed him once and must spend eternity atoning. Around me, the children recited along with him. They knew the words by heart, had been speaking them since they could form sentences. Their voices rose in mechanical unison, a choir of pre-programmed devotion. I didn't speak. I couldn't. The narrative was so vast, so terrible, so utterly devoid of hope that words failed me. The Imperium, I was learning, wasn't a government. It was a grinding machine that consumed lives by the trillion and called it holy. And I was being taught to worship it. The shock maul found my spine. "Speak the words, heretic," Mordax hissed, "or I will tear them from your throat and feed them back to you." I spoke. What choice did I have? "The Emperor protects." The words tasted like ash. The second week they broke my mind. They showed me the pictorials. Hour after hour, day after day, images of humanity's enemies flickered across screens mounted to the prayer hall walls. The greenskins I'd already encountered. The insectoid tyrannids that devoured worlds. The elegant, cruel Eldari who treated humans as playthings. The mechanized Necrons risen from tombs older than human history. And worst of all, the ruinous powers. Chaos. Even the word felt dangerous, like speaking it aloud would summon something hungry and vast. The images they showed were heavily censored, blurred, and redacted, but what remained was enough to induce nightmares I couldn't escape even when awake. Demons of impossible geometry. Space Marines turned traitor, their armor twisted into mockeries of faith. Worlds where reality itself had shattered, where the laws of physics were suggestions and suffering was the only constant. "This is what awaits humanity if we fail," Mordax explained, his augmetic eye glowing brighter as the images grew worse. This is the price of weakness, of doubt, of mercy. Every moment you hesitate is a moment chaos gains ground. Every life you spare that should be purged is a potential vector for corruption. There is no innocence, Sigma 7. There is only varying degrees of guilt. I wanted to argue, wanted to say that mercy wasn't weakness, that compassion wasn't disease, that surely there had to be a better way than grinding up billions in an eternal war machine. But then they showed me what happened to worlds that fell to chaos. The images were brief, even heavily censored, but sufficient. People fused into screaming walls of flesh. Children transformed into something that couldn't be called alive but couldn't quite die. Reality inverted, perverted, violated in ways that made the word evil seem quaintly insufficient. "Now do you understand?" Mordax asked. I understood that I was being given a choice between two hells. The Imperium's grinding oppression or Chaos's shrieking madness. There was no third option, no escape, no hope of anything better. "Yes," I whispered. "Louder." "Yes." "Then swear it. Swear you will serve the Emperor without question, without hesitation, without the poison of conscience to slow your hand." I opened my mouth to refuse, to say that some part of me had to remain, some core of who I'd been before the ice and the darkness. But then I looked at the children around me, 10 years old, maybe 12, already reciting oaths of eternal service with perfect conviction. And I realized something terrible. They were happy, not joyful, but content in the way that absolute certainty brings contentment. They knew their purpose, they knew their place. They would serve and die and never once question whether there might be another way. Because questioning was the first step toward damnation. And I envied them. "I swear," I said, and felt something inside me crack. Not break, not yet, but crack, like ice beginning to fracture under weight it can no longer bear. "Good," Mordax replied. "Now swear it again, and again, until the words are reflex, until doubt is physically impossible." We swore for 6 days straight. By the end, I believed it. The third week, they broke my soul. The final stage of indoctrination was called Pilgrimage of Understanding, though there was no journey involved. Instead, they took me deep into the Skola's lowest levels, where the air smelled of recycled breath and forgotten sins, and showed me the servo skulls. Hundreds of them, thousands. Floating in neat rows, their organic components, human skulls, stripped of flesh and fitted with anti-grav units and data recording equipment, hovering in the darkness like a constellation of the damned. These were servants of the Imperium, Mordax explained, his augmetic voice echoing in the vast chamber. Scribes, remembrancers, low-level administratum functionaries. In life, they were mediocre, forgettable. But in death they serve perfectly. No fatigue, no doubt, no mercy to corrupt their function. This is the goal, Sigma 7. To transcend the weakness of living flesh and become pure function. I stared at the skulls, at the empty eye sockets, at the imperial aquila engraved into foreheads, at the data ports drilled through temples, and felt horror so profound it transcended language. "You're saying this is the reward for service?" "Reward?" Mordax's remaining organic eye widened. "This is an honor. These servants continue their duty long after biological death would have ended them. They are efficient. They are obedient. They are free from the burden of choice." He led me deeper past the servo skulls into a chamber that made the previous horror seem merciful. Servitors. They lined the walls, plugged into charging stations, their human forms so heavily modified it was difficult to tell where flesh ended and machinery began. Arms replaced with industrial tools. Eyes swapped for targeting arrays. Brains lobotomized and programmed with single, simple functions they would perform for decades until their organic components finally failed. "Most are criminals," Mordax said, noting my expression. "Heretics, traitors, those who refuse to serve in life. Now they serve perfectly. Some, however, are volunteers. Those who understand that their flesh is weak, but their duty need not end. This is insane, I whispered. The shock maul took me in the back of the skull. I went down hard, vision swimming, and Mordax's face filled my blurred sight. Insanity, he said softly, is believing humanity deserves better than survival. The Emperor offers us continuance, nothing more. We will not thrive. We will not grow. We will simply persist, one more day, one more year, one more millennium until either we outlast the galaxy's hatred or we are finally extinguished. This is the promise. This is the faith. And you will believe it, Sigma 7, because the alternative is worse than any hell we could devise. He hauled me to my feet with strength that belied his ancient frame. Now, he continued, you will pray. You will pray for 6 hours without ceasing. You will thank the Emperor for allowing you to serve. You will beg forgiveness for your doubt, and you will mean every word, or I will begin removing parts of you until belief is no longer optional. I prayed. Emperor, forgive me, I prayed with conviction. Because in that moment, surrounded by the servo skulls and servitors and the grinding horror of imperial efficiency, I understood the terrible logic. In a galaxy of infinite cruelty, survival was the only virtue. Compassion got people killed. Mercy spread corruption. Doubt opened doors that should remain sealed. The Imperium was monstrous, yes, but it was the only monster keeping worse monsters at bay. On the final day, they gave me my new designation. You are no longer Sigma 7, Mordax intoned during the ceremony. The other inductees watched, children now fully inducted, their eyes bright with faith I envied and pitied in equal measure. You are the Exemplar. You will stand as proof that even the lost can be reclaimed, that even the wayward can be brought back to the Emperor's light. You will serve in his armies, and wherever you go, you will be the symbol that inspires others to lay down their lives willingly. They dressed me in armor newly forged, ceramite painted in the gray and gold of the Schola Progenium's martial orders. They returned my shield, the Aquila polished until it gleamed. They gave me weapons blessed by priests and a purity seal inscribed with words I'd memorized through repetition until they felt like truth. Do you accept this duty? Mordax asked. I looked at him, this fusion of flesh and machine, faith and function, and I saw my future. Decades, maybe centuries of unending service, of wars fought not for victory but for survival, of watching billions die so trillions might persist one more day. I accept, I said, and I meant it. The applause from the children was like the sound of a prison door closing. They shipped me out that same night. As the transport climbed toward orbit, I looked back at the Schola Progenium, those gray fortresses where they murdered doubt and called it education, and felt the crack inside me widen just a little further. I had believed in something once, justice, freedom, the idea that people deserve protection not because they were useful but because they were people. Those beliefs were dying. In their place, something new was growing. Something cold and efficient and absolutely committed to the Imperium's continuation, no matter the cost. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself there was no other way. I told myself the Emperor protects. And with each repetition, the lie became easier to believe. Hive Arthemis was dying when we arrived. The planet dominated the viewport as our transport descended through atmospheric turbulence that rattled teeth and tested hull integrity. Below, the Hive city sprawled like a metallic cancer across the planet's surface, 200 kilometers wide, reaching 30 kilometers into the sky, and burrowing equally deep into the planet's crust. 60 billion souls lived in that vertical labyrinth of steel and stone, packed so densely that personal space was measured in centimeters rather than meters. And it was burning. Even from orbit, I could see the fires raging through the lower levels. The Underhive, they called it, the lawless depths where the Imperium's light barely reached and survival was a daily negotiation with violence. The orcs had breached there first, erupting from the planet's subterranean caverns like a green tide of muscle and rage. Third orc incursion in 6 months, the pilot informed me, his voice crackling through the transport's failing Vox system. They just keep coming. We kill them by the millions and more crawl up from the deep places. It's like they're growing down there. Breeding in the dark. I said nothing. Since leaving the Schola Progenium, I'd learned that silence was often the best response. Words led to questions. Questions led to doubt. Doubt led to the shock mall, or worse. The transport shuddered as we punched through the final atmospheric layer. Below, the Hive city loomed like a fortress built by madmen. All jutting spires and tangled transit tubes, gantries spanning impossible distances, and exhaust ports belching pollution in endless streams. Millions of lights flickered in the darkness, each one representing lives I was being sent to preserve, or spend. It was increasingly difficult to tell the difference. The briefing took place in a command bunker carved from the Hive's superstructure, 30 kilometers above the surface and 20 kilometers below the spire's peak. The air here was slightly less toxic than the exterior, filtered through systems that hummed with the constant edge of mechanical failure. Servo skulls floated through the space like morbid attendants, recording everything for archives no one would ever read. Commissar General Vaskovich ran the briefing. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 40 standard years, with a bionic left arm that whirred softly when she moved and a scar bisecting her face from hairline to jaw. Her uniform was immaculate despite the chaos outside, as if she'd decided that maintaining appearances was its own form of warfare against entropy. The situation, she began without preamble, gesturing to a hololithic display that showed the Hive's cross-section, is untenable but not yet catastrophic. The Greenskins have captured levels 380 through 427 of the primary Hive structure. Approximately 9 billion civilians remain trapped in those zones, with casualty estimates increasing hourly. 9 billion. Trapped. I kept my face neutral, but my mind recoiled. 9 billion people, more than had lived in entire regions I remembered from before the ice. Simply written off as trapped in a briefing delivered with the emotional investment of reading a shipping manifest. Our objective is not evacuation, Vaskovich continued, confirming my worst suspicions. Transit capacity cannot accommodate movement of that population scale within tactically relevant time frames. Instead, we will collapse the transit corridors between levels 427 and 428, sealing the Greenskins in the lower levels with the civilian population. You're going to bury them, I said. Not a question, an observation. Vaskovich's gaze fixed on me, her expression unreadable. We are going to contain the threat while preserving the remaining 51 billion souls in the upper levels. The mathematics are simple, Exemplar. We lose 9 to save 51, or we lose all 60 attempting a rescue that cannot succeed. There has to be another way. There is not. Her voice carried the flat finality of someone who'd had this argument countless times, and won every instance through sheer attrition. You have been assigned command of Penal Legion Gamma 773, approximately 5,000 conscripts, to hold Transit Corridor Epsilon Major for 72 hours, while demolition teams prepare the collapse charges. You will prevent any Greenskins from breaching into the upper levels. You will not evacuate civilians. You will hold. Questions? I had thousands. Instead, I asked the only one that mattered. After the collapse, what happens to the people trapped below? Vascovich's scarred face might have softened, but the lighting made it difficult to tell. They are martyrs, she said quietly. The Emperor will know their sacrifice. That is all we can offer them. She dismissed me before I could formulate a response that wouldn't get me shot. Penal Legion Gamma 773 was assembled in what had once been a freight-loading bay, now converted to a military staging area through the simple expedient of painting Imperial Aquilas on the walls and installing a few automated gun servitors to discourage desertion. 5,000 souls in red prisoner fatigues, explosive collars gleaming under harsh lighting, watching me with expressions ranging from desperate hope to resigned fatalism. They were younger than the previous Penal Legion I'd led. More women. More obvious signs of malnutrition and abuse. These weren't hardened criminals being given redemption through death. These were people who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, swept up by quota-obsessed administratum officials who needed bodies and didn't particularly care what those bodies had done or failed to do. "Listen up," I said, and my voice, enhanced, projected, impossible to ignore, silenced the nervous murmuring. "I'm the Exemplar. In approximately 2 hours, we're going to descend into hell. We're going to face an enemy that doesn't know fear, doesn't understand surrender, and takes joy in violence the way normal people take joy in breathing. Most of you are going to die." Brutal honesty. I'd learned in the manufacturums of that first world that lies didn't motivate people facing certain death. Only truth could do that. "But," I continued, "some of you will survive. I can't promise you freedom. I can't promise you rewards. What I can promise is this. If you stay close to me, if you follow my orders without hesitation, I will kill more of the enemy than you thought possible. I will give you a chance. That's all I have to offer." A hand raised in the back, a boy. Couldn't have been more than 16 with a collar that looked too large for his thin neck. "Is it true?" he asked, voice cracking. "What they say? That you're from before the Emperor? That you're from the age when things were better?" The question hit me like a shock maul to the chest. From before the Emperor. The age when things were better. The ice and the half-memories I couldn't quite grasp. The sense that yes, once there had been something less monstrous than this endless grinding war. I could have told him yes. Could have given him hope that somewhere, somewhen humanity had been more than ammunition. Instead, I said, "That person is dead. I'm what's left. And what's left is very good at keeping people alive long enough to kill the enemy. That's going to have to be enough." It was the first time I'd admitted it, even to myself. Whoever I'd been before, whatever ideals I'd carried, whatever world had shaped me into something that believed in justice and freedom, was gone. The Schola Progenium had killed that person as surely as a bolt round through the brain. I was the Exemplar now, and the Exemplar knew how to win imperial victories. The descent into the Underhive took 4 hours through transit corridors that grew progressively more nightmarish with each level. The architecture changed as we dropped, from the ordered efficiency of the upper hive to the chaotic sprawl of the mid-levels to the absolute pandemonium of the depths. Here buildings had been stacked on buildings for millennia, creating a vertical maze where up and down became suggestions rather than facts. The smell hit us first. Not the clean smell of industry or even the acrid stench of pollution, but something organic and wrong. Fungal. The orcs, I'd been briefed, spread a biological marker wherever they went. Spores that would eventually grow into more greenskins if not purged with fire. The Underhive was becoming a breeding ground. We found the first civilians on level 394. They'd barricaded themselves in what might have been a habitation block, using everything from furniture to corpses to create a barrier against the outside. 200 people, maybe 300, crushed into a space designed for 50. Children crying. Adults staring with the hollow-eyed shock of those who'd seen things that broke fundamental assumptions about reality. "Please," their leader begged, a woman whose name I didn't ask because names made things harder. "Please, you have to help us. The greenskins, they're everywhere. They killed anyone who couldn't run fast enough. We've been hiding for 2 days without food or water. Please." I looked at her, at the desperate hope in her eyes, at the children clinging to her legs, and felt the crack inside me widen further. "We're not here to evacuate you," I said, and hated how steady my voice remained. "We're here to hold the corridor while they seal the levels. I'm sorry, there's no transport capacity." "But we'll die here," she whispered. "Yes." The word hung in the recycled air like a death sentence, because that's what it was. "However," I continued, surprising myself, "if you can make it to transit point Epsilon 7 within the next 12 hours, there's a cargo lift that might still have some capacity before the collapse. It's 30 kilometers from here through hostile territory. I can't guarantee anything, but it's a chance." It was a lie. The cargo lift had been marked for demolition like everything else, but giving them a destination, a purpose, something to do besides wait for death, that was a mercy I could offer, even if the outcome was predetermined. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Emperor bless you, thank you." I turned away before my face could betray the emptiness of the blessing. We found the orcs on level 401. They came at us through a manufactorum that had been dead for centuries, its machinery rusted into abstract sculptures of decay. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. It was difficult to count when they moved like a green avalanche of muscle and crude metal. They wore armor that looked like it had been beaten into shape from random scrap, and they carried weapons that shouldn't have functioned but worked through what could only be described as collective belief made manifest. "For the wa!" their war chief bellowed, a creature easily 3 meters tall with arms thick as transit tubes. "For the fight!" They hit our lines like a tsunami. The penal legionnaires opened fire with laser guns that painted the darkness in strobing red. Las bolts found green flesh, burned through muscle, and the orcs laughed. Actually laughed as if being shot was the most entertaining thing they'd experienced all day. "Hold position," I roared, and my enhanced voice cut through the chaos. "Gamma 773, hold position and fire at will." I didn't wait for them to obey. My shield came up and I charged. The first orc I hit simply ceased to exist from the waist up. The ceramite shield, backed by my enhanced strength and momentum, hit with enough force to turn flesh and bone into paste. The second lost its head to my combat blade, a chainsword they'd issued me that screamed its devotion to the Emperor with each rotation. The third, fourth, and fifth died so quickly I couldn't track individual kills. I became a storm of violence. The shield blocked incoming attacks that would have killed lesser soldiers. The chainsword separated limbs and heads with brutal efficiency. My enhanced body moved with a speed and precision that turned combat into a form of terrible mathematics. Calculate angle, apply force, confirm kill, repeat. Behind me, the penal legion rallied. They'd been given hope, not the false hope of survival, but the real hope of dying while taking the enemy with them. They fought with the fury of people who'd been told they were expendable and decided to make their expenditure cost the Emperor's enemies dearly. We killed them. Emperor, help me. We killed them by the hundreds. The manufactorum floor became slick with blood, human and greenskin mixed until it was impossible to tell which was which. The air filled with the smell of burned flesh and the screaming of chainswords and the deeper bass roar of orc biology refusing to accept death gracefully. 3 hours. That's how long the first major engagement lasted. When it ended, the manufactorum was silent except for the moaning of the wounded and the wet breathing of those dying slowly. Of the 5,000 souls who descended with me, 3,800 remained combat effective, acceptable losses by Imperial standards. I walked among the wounded and I made the decisions that commanders make. Who could be saved? Who couldn't? Who would receive mercy from a bolt pistol rather than slow death from wounds that exceeded our medical capacity? I pulled a young woman from beneath an orc corpse, the same boy from the briefing who'd asked about the better age. His collar had been cracked by shrapnel, the explosive disabled. "You're free," I told him, not sure if I was being cruel or kind. "The collar's dead. You could run." He looked at me with eyes that had aged decades in hours. "Where would I go?" he asked. "They're sealing the levels. We're all dead anyway." He picked up his laser gun and returned to the line. I didn't stop him. We held Transit Corridor Epsilon Major for 74 hours, 2 hours longer than ordered, because the demolition teams were delayed and we had no choice but to continue fighting. By the end, Penal Legion Gamma 773 had been reduced to 212 effectives. We'd killed an estimated 15,000 orcs. The corridor walls were pocked with last burns and bloodstains that would never wash clean. When Commissar General Vaskovich finally arrived with the demolition teams, she surveyed the carnage with the expression of someone reviewing a successful business transaction. "Exemplary work, Exemplar," she said, and I wasn't sure if the pun was intentional. "The collapse charges are armed. We evacuate in 10 minutes." "What about the survivors?" I asked, gesturing to my remaining soldiers. "They perform their function admirably. Emperor's mercy awaits them." It took me a moment to understand. Then I saw the demolition team's weapons tracking toward my penal legionnaires, and I understood that Emperor's mercy meant a bolt round rather than being buried alive in the collapse. "They earned better than this," I said quietly. "They earned a quick death instead of a slow one," Vaskovich replied. "In the Imperium, that is the highest honor we can bestow." The bolters fired. 212 souls who'd fought beyond any reasonable expectation, who'd held against impossible odds, who'd earned the right to be called soldiers rather than ammunition, executed because the Imperium didn't have transport capacity and couldn't risk them spreading rumors about what had happened in the deep Hive. I watched them die. I didn't look away. I owed them that much. As the transport climbed toward orbit and the Hive city shrank behind us, the collapse charges detonated. I watched through the viewport as entire levels pancaked downward, crushing 9 billion souls in an instant of merciful violence rather than leaving them to the orcs' slower brutality. 9 billion martyrs. The mathematics made sense. 9 to save 51. Acceptable losses. Efficient resource allocation. The crack inside me became a chasm. I told myself the Imperium was necessary, the only thing standing between humanity and infinite horrors. That its cruelty was unfortunate but unavoidable. But watching those levels collapse, knowing I'd helped seal 9 billion people to their deaths while lying to desperate civilians about cargo lifts that wouldn't save them, that wasn't necessity. That was the banal evil of a system so vast and so broken that it could only solve problems by throwing bodies at them until the bodies ran out, and I had become its instrument. "The Emperor protects," Vaskovich said beside me, watching the same viewport, the same collapse. "Does he?" I asked. She looked at me with something that might have been pity. "No," she admitted. "But we pretend he does because the alternative is admitting we're alone in the dark with monsters we can't defeat. So we make our sacrifices, we spend our ammunition, and we survive one more day. That's all we can do, Exemplar. That's all we've ever been able to do." The transport jumped to warp space, and Hive Arthemis disappeared behind the screaming wall of unreality. I didn't sleep for 3 days. When I finally did, I dreamed of ice and a world where people had names instead of designations, where 9 billion deaths would have been unthinkable rather than tactically acceptable. I woke up wishing the dream had been real. But if it ever was, that world was dead, and I was the weapon of the one that had replaced it. Sanctified Illyria was beautiful. That was the first thing that struck me as our transport descended through atmosphere unmarred by industrial pollution. The sky was actually blue, not the sickly gray blue of dying worlds or the angry red of forge planets, but a clear, clean azure that made my enhanced eyes water from sheer unfamiliarity. Below, the world sprawled in calculated perfection, vast cathedrals of white stone, meditation gardens arranged in sacred geometries, processional roads wide enough for armies that instead hosted only pilgrims. 15 billion faithful called this world home. 15 billion souls who dedicated their existence to worshiping the God Emperor, who'd turned an entire planet into one vast prayer offered up to the master of mankind. It was the kind of place that should have felt holy. Instead, it felt like a tomb wearing the face of paradise. "Beautiful, isn't it?" asked Interrogator Valdine, the inquisitorial representative assigned to our regiment. She stood beside me at the viewport, her red robes and rosarius marking her as one of the Ordos Hereticus, the witch hunters, the keepers of faith, the ones who found corruption and burned it down to the atomic level. The ecclesiarchy spent 3,000 years perfecting Illyria, every stone placed with devotion. Every garden planted to reflect the Emperor's glory. It's a masterwork of human faith given physical form. "Then why are we here?" I asked. "What threat requires military intervention on a shrine world?" Valdine's smile was cold enough to freeze Prometheum. "The threat," she said, "is hunger, and the sin is asking questions about where their food has gone." The briefing took place in a commandeered cathedral that had been converted into a military command center with the brutal efficiency that characterized all imperial operations. Sacred statues had been shoved against walls to make room for hololithic displays. Prayer benches became weapons racks. The altar itself now served as a planning table, its sanctified surface buried under data slates and tactical maps. Governor Militant Hesperus ran the briefing. He was grotesquely obese in a way that seemed obscene on a world where people were supposedly starving. Flesh overflowing his ceremonial armor, jowls quivering as he spoke, multiple chins wobbling with each emphatic gesture. His eyes, small and cruel in the fat landscape of his face, tracked across the assembled officers with the lazy confidence of someone who'd never personally experienced consequences. "The situation," he wheezed, "is a minor logistical disruption being exploited by malcontents and heretics. The planetary tithe to the Imperial Guard required an increase of 14% this quarter to support the Crusade in the Tertian sector. This necessitated redirecting grain shipments from civilian distribution to military stockpiles, a temporary measure, entirely reasonable." "How temporary?" asked Colonel Draven, commander of the Guard regiment I'd been attached to. He was Cadian, or what remained of the Cadians after their world broke, and had the look of someone who'd spent his entire life at war and developed strong opinions about waste. 6 months, perhaps 8, possibly 12 depending on Crusade logistics. "And the civilian population?" Draven pressed. "Has sufficient reserves," Hesperus replied, though his eyes shifted away from direct contact. "The ecclesiarchy maintains emergency stores. Rationing protocols are in effect. There may be some discomfort, but the faithful understand sacrifice." Interrogator Valdine stepped forward, her servo-skull attendants whirring in formation around her head. "The discomfort has manifested as riots in 7 of the 12 primary cathedral cities. Approximately 3 million pilgrims have gathered at the governor's palace demanding restoration of food shipments. They've stopped working. They've stopped praying. They're questioning the Imperium's wisdom. The last sentence landed like a death sentence. Questions, Valdine continued, her voice dropping to something colder than void space, lead to doubt. Doubt leads to heresy. Heresy leads to damnation. The Emperor's will is absolute. Those who question it have already begun the slide into corruption, whether they realize it or not. I felt something tighten in my chest, not pain, but recognition. I'd heard this logic before in the Schola Progenium from Drill Abbot Mordax. The same circular reasoning that made all resistance heretical by definition. "What are our orders?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Governor Hesperus smiled, and it was one of the ugliest expressions I'd ever seen on a human face. Dispersal of illegal assembly, restoration of civil order, suppression of heretical sentiment by any means necessary. "They're starving," I said quietly. "They're not heretics, they're hungry." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Valdine turned to me slowly, her servo skulls swiveling to focus their recording devices on my face. "Exemplar," she said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority older than most stellar nations. "Are you suggesting that legitimate grievances justify questioning the Imperium's sacred hierarchy?" It was a trap. I could feel the jaws closing around me even as I spoke. "I'm suggesting that proportional response might prevent the situation from escalating. Feed the population, solve the problem. Killing them creates martyrs and confirms their worst beliefs about imperial governance." "Imperial governance," Hesperus wheezed, his face reddening, "does not require validation from its subjects. It requires obedience. These malcontents will obey, or they will serve as examples of what befalls those who question the Emperor's appointed representatives." Colonel Draven caught my eye and gave the smallest shake of his head. "A warning. Stand down. Don't make this your hill to die on." But I couldn't. Something in me, some fragment of whoever I'd been before the ice, refused to accept the logic that starvation was an acceptable tool of governance and questioning it was heresy. "With respect," I said, knowing the words would cost me, "this is wrong." Valdine's smile could have cut ceramite. "Your objection is noted, Exemplar, and will be included in my report to the Ordos Hereticus. For now, you will follow your orders. The Emperor's will is not subject to your approval." She produced a data slate and handed it to me. On its screen, a single image. The crowd gathered at the governor's palace. 3 million souls, maybe more, filling the processional plaza like a human sea. Men, women, children. The faithful who'd come to this world seeking spiritual fulfillment and found only hunger. "You will take your attached guard company," Valdine said, "and clear that plaza. Lethal force is authorized. Expected, in fact. The Imperium must demonstrate that questioning authority carries consequences severe enough to prevent repetition." "You want me to massacre civilians?" I said. "Not a question. A statement of fact. I want you to eliminate heretics before their corruption spreads. The distinction," Valdine replied, "is theological rather than practical, but it matters for the record. We deployed at dawn when the light was weakest and the faithful most tired from their overnight vigil. The company they'd given me was Mordian Iron Guard, professional soldiers who'd turned discipline into an art form, who could march in parade formation while under artillery fire and never miss a step. 200 soldiers in immaculate uniforms, laser guns charged and ready, faces hidden behind rebreather masks that made them look more like machines than men. And me. The Exemplar. The symbol. The weapon they wheeled out when they needed someone who could kill efficiently and looked like he might have moral authority. We approached the plaza through the Street of Martyrs, a wide processional avenue lined with statues of imperial saints who died gloriously for the emperor. The irony wasn't lost on me. The crowd filled the plaza from edge to edge, a sea of humanity that should have been praying but instead was simply standing, waiting, hoping that someone would listen. They erected crude banners with slogans I could read from 100 meters away. The Emperor provides. Faith without food is death. We served, now we starve. Not heretical slogans, not calls for rebellion or revolution, just hunger, expressed as hope that the system they dedicated their lives to might care whether they lived or died. We took up positions at the plaza's northern edge, our line of 200 facing 3 million. The math was absurd. Even with my enhanced abilities, even with the Iron Guard's discipline, we couldn't actually clear this crowd by force. We could only kill enough to terrify the rest into dispersing. Which was, of course, the point. Colonel Draven approached me as the soldiers checked their weapons. He was old, maybe 60 standard years, ancient by guard standards, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by someone who'd run out of patience halfway through. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I can lead the dispersal. You're valuable enough that Valdine probably won't execute you for refusing. Probably." "And you?" I asked. He shrugged. "I'm Cadian. We don't refuse orders. It's not in our cultural lexicon." "Even bad orders?" "Especially bad orders. Someone has to do the dirty work, Exemplar. Someone has to be the monster so the Imperium can pretend it's civilized. I've made my peace with being that someone. Question is, have you?" I looked at the crowd, at the families huddled together, at the children who didn't understand why their parents looked so worried, at the elderly pilgrims who'd come here to die in faith and found themselves dying of hunger instead. "No," I admitted. "I haven't." "Then this is going to hurt," Draven said. He wasn't talking about physical pain. The Voxcasters crackled to life, broadcasting Valdine's amplified voice across the plaza. "Citizens of sanctified Illyria, you have assembled unlawfully. You have ceased your labors. You have questioned the wisdom of the Emperor's appointed governance. These actions constitute sedition under imperial law. You have one opportunity to disperse. Those who remain in 5 minutes will be classified as heretics and dealt with accordingly. The Emperor's mercy is offered once. This is that offer." The crowd didn't move. Of course they didn't. They'd come too far, suffered too much to be scared off by threats. They'd already decided that dying here, making their point, was preferable to returning to their homes to starve quietly while the governor hoarded food in his palace. 3 million people calling the Imperium's bluff. And we were about to prove it wasn't a bluff. I activated my company's command channel. "Iron Guard, load for crowd dispersal. Non-lethal munitions first. We try to scare them before we—" "Negative." Valdine's voice cut through my channel, cold and absolute. "Lethal munitions only. This is not a negotiation, Exemplar. This is an example. Load for kill. Execute on my mark." I watched the Iron Guard soldiers swap their power cells from training rounds to standard loss charges. Watched them check their firing solutions. Watched them become the machines their training had designed them to be. "Exemplar." It was Draven, private channel. "If you're going to refuse, now's the time. I'll back your play if you're serious about it. But if you're not, then give the order and live with it. Hesitation gets us all killed and accomplishes nothing." I looked at my shield, the Aquila gleaming in the dawn light, symbol of an Imperium that would kill 3 million of its own citizens for the crime of being hungry. I looked at the crowd, families holding hands, priests leading prayers, people who'd done nothing wrong except believe the system they served might care about their survival. I looked at the Iron Guard, soldiers who'd follow my orders without question because that's what soldiers did, who'd live with the nightmares because someone had to pull the trigger. And I made the choice that would define everything that came after. Iron Guard, I said into the command channel, my voice steady even as something inside me shattered. Prepare to fire. The soldiers raised their laser guns, 200 barrels pointed at 3 million hearts. Wait! A voice from the crowd amplified somehow. Wait, please! We're not heretics. We're loyal. We just want to eat. Please, we have children. Please! It was the woman who'd spoken. I could see her now standing on an improvised platform in the plaza's center. Her robes marking her as an ecclesiarchy deacon. Her face was gaunt with hunger. But her voice carried the desperate conviction of someone making a final plea to a God she still believed might listen. We've served the Emperor all our lives, she cried. We've prayed. We've tithed. We've given everything. Just let us live, please. The Emperor is merciful. Show us his mercy. The plaza fell silent. 3 million souls holding their breath. And Interrogator Valdine gave the order. Fire. I didn't give the order to fire. But I didn't countermand it either. The Iron Guard opened up with the mechanical precision that centuries of training had instilled. Last fire painted the dawn in strobing red. The sound was like 1,000 whip cracks happening simultaneously, echoing off the cathedral walls until it became one continuous scream. People died. The deacon woman, the one who'd pleaded for mercy, caught a las round in the chest and simply stopped existing from the sternum up. The crowd behind her, packed so densely they couldn't dodge, absorbed the volley like a sponge absorbing water. Bodies fell in neat rows, killed by disciplined fire that treated execution like a military drill. The screaming started immediately. 3 million voices trying to flee, crushing each other in the panic, trampling the fallen, surging against the plaza's edges like water against a dam. The Iron Guard continued firing, methodical and efficient, their training overriding any human impulse toward mercy. "Cease fire!" I roared into the command channel. "Negative," Valdine overrode me. "Continue firing until compliance is achieved." The Iron Guard, trained to obey the highest-ranking authority, continued their execution. I watched it happen. I could have stopped it, thrown myself between the guns and the crowd, used my enhanced body to physically block the firing line, forced them to kill me first. It would have been futile, theatrical, and ultimately meaningless. They'd have removed me and continued the massacre, but I would have tried. The me from before the ice, whoever that was, would have tried. Instead, I stood there, shield at my side, and watched as the Imperium demonstrated the consequences of questioning authority. The Iron Guard fired for approximately 4 minutes before the plaza was clear. Not empty, there were bodies, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, but clear of living, standing resistance. The survivors fled into the city's labyrinthine streets and we let them go. The point had been made. I looked at the plaza. The bodies sprawled like broken dolls, the blood running in streams between ancient stones, the scattered belongings of people who'd come seeking justice and found only efficient violence, and felt the last fragment of who I'd been die. "Exemplar." Valdine approached, her servo skulls recording everything, her face showing the satisfied expression of someone who'd just confirmed a theological hypothesis. "Your hesitation was noted. Your failure to enthusiastically execute orders was noted. Your question about proportional response was noted. You are dangerously close to being classified as a sympathizer, which carries its own consequences." "They were innocent," I said, my voice flat. "They were disobedient," she corrected. "In the Imperium, these are functionally identical. You will remember this lesson, Exemplar. The Emperor's mercy is extinction rather than corruption. Death rather than doubt. We killed 3,000 today to prevent 3 million from sliding into heresy. The mathematics favor our action. The mathematics, I repeated. Everything was mathematics now. Acceptable losses, resource allocation, the calculus of atrocity. Return to your transport, Valdine ordered. You're being reassigned. Your skills are needed on Kolos Tertius, where there's a proper war being fought. Perhaps killing real enemies rather than misguided civilians will restore your enthusiasm for the Emperor's work. She walked away, her servo skulls trailing like a mechanical halo, leaving me standing in a plaza that smelled of burned flesh and the death of whatever ideals I'd carried from before. Colonel Draven approached, his ancient face unreadable. "You're wondering if there was another way," he said. Not a question. Yes, there wasn't. There never is. The Imperium's too big, too broken, too desperate to survive to afford nuance. We get orders, we execute them, we live with the consequences because the alternative is watching everything burn. How? I asked. How do you live with it? Draven looked at me with something that might have been pity. You stop being the person who'd ask that question. You become the person who can pull the trigger without hesitation. It's the only way to survive in the Imperial Guard. He paused. Or you eat a bolt pistol in private and hope the Emperor forgives you. Those are the two options. He left me there, alone among the bodies. I didn't eat a bolt pistol. I wish I had. The transport to Kolos Tertius departed 6 hours later. As we climbed toward orbit, I watched sanctified Illyria shrink in the viewport. That beautiful world of white cathedrals and perfect gardens now marked by mass graves being dug in the processional plaza. Governor Hesperus remained in power. The food shipments continued to the Crusade. The remaining population returned to work, their questions silenced by the corpses of those who dared to ask. The Imperium called it a successful pacification operation. I called it the day I realized I was no longer capable of meaningful resistance. I'd stood at the moral event horizon, the point where right and wrong still mattered, where choice was still possible. And I'd chosen to stand aside while innocence died, not because I believed it was right, but because I believed resistance was futile. The crack inside me had become a canyon. And somewhere at the bottom, drowning in darkness, was the person I'd been before the ice, before the Imperium, before I learned that in a galaxy of infinite cruelty, standing on principle was just another form of suicide. I thought about that deacon woman, the one who'd pleaded for mercy, who'd believed to the end that the Emperor would protect. He hadn't. He never did. And I was his weapon, whether I wanted to be or not. The last thing I saw before we jumped to warp space was my own reflection in the viewport. Ceramite armor, Imperial Aquila, and eyes that looked increasingly like the servo skulls that recorded everything and felt nothing. I barely recognized myself. Soon I wouldn't recognize myself at all. And that, I was learning, was the point. Kolos Tertius was a world that had given up pretending to be habitable. The ash wastes stretched from horizon to horizon in every direction, endless gray dunes of industrial fallout and pulverized stone, remnants of a manufacturing capacity so vast it had literally consumed the planet's biosphere and replaced it with waste. The sky was a perpetual twilight, choked with particulate matter that turned the sun into a dying ember. Nothing grew here. Nothing lived here except the soldiers who'd been sent to kill each other over territory that wasn't worth the ammunition spent claiming it. Strategic value, negligible. Symbolic value, immeasurable. That was the briefing I'd received during the 3-week warp transit. Kolos Tertius sat at the intersection of 3 subsectors, making it technically important despite being practically worthless. The Imperium held the northern wastes. The traitors held the southern. Between us lay a no-man's land of trenches, razor wire, and bodies that hadn't decayed because even bacteria had abandoned this world as unworthy of effort. We'd been fighting here for 7 years. Casualty estimates exceeded 40 million on both sides. Territory gained or lost, approximately 16 kilometers. "Welcome to the meat grinder," said Major Castine as our transport settled into the landing zone. A cleared section of ash marked by flak gun emplacements and concertina wire. She was Valhallan, wrapped in layers of winter gear despite the planet's ambient temperature being well above freezing. Where we die slowly instead of all at once and call it strategy. I'd been assigned to her regiment, the Valhallan 217th, as an inspirational attachment. The Departamento Munitorum's terminology for morale is collapsing. Soldiers are eating their lasguns rather than facing another day in the trenches. Send them a symbol to convince them that dying here matters. "How bad is it?" I asked. Castine's laugh was bitter. "We execute more soldiers for desertion than the enemy kills in combat. That answer your question?" The trenches were worse than I'd imagined. I'd fought in underhives and manufactorums in cathedral cities and transit corridors, but those battles had been mobile, dynamic. There was an illusion of progress, even if it was measured in corpses per kilometer. Here, there was only the trench. 3 meters deep, carved into ash that collapsed if you looked at it wrong. Reinforced with whatever materials the Munitorum deemed expendable enough to ship to a world that didn't matter. The walls were lined with corrugated steel that wept with condensation. The floor was duckboard laid over mud that had been created by 8 months of rain mixing with ash to form a paste that swallowed anything that fell into it. Soldiers lived in this trench, ate in it, slept in it, died in it. The smell hit me first. Unwashed bodies, human waste, gangrene, and the sweet rot of corpses that hadn't been recovered because retrieval meant exposing yourself to sniper fire. The men and women huddled in firing positions looked less like soldiers and more like animals that had been beaten into a corner and left to starve. "Valhallan 217th 2nd Company 4th Platoon," Castine announced as we moved through the trench system. 47 effectives out of an authorized strength of 120. We lost 30 to combat last month, 26 to disease. The rest to execution for desertion or self-inflicted wounds. She said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd report inventory discrepancies. "And the enemy?" I asked. "Same situation, different uniform. They're dying just as fast as we are. Difference is they used to be us. They know exactly how we think, how we fight, what breaks us. Makes them more dangerous than orcs or tyrannids ever could be." "Traitors," I said, and the word tasted like poison. "Renegades," Castine corrected. "There's a difference. Traitors worship chaos, paint themselves in blasphemous symbols, get mutations and demon weapons. These poor bastards just stopped believing the Imperium was worth dying for. Still human, still using Imperial equipment and tactics. Just fighting under a different flag." We reached the forward observation post, a section of trench with slightly better firing positions and a periscope that let you observe no man's land without exposing your head to snipers. Castine gestured for me to take a look. I did. The killing ground stretched for 2 kilometers, a wasteland of razor wire, shell craters, and corpses in various states of decomposition. And beyond it, barely visible through the ash-choked air, I could see them. The enemy trenches, Imperial Guard trenches, defended by Imperial Guard soldiers, who'd simply decided they were done dying for the Imperium. "They raid us every few nights," Castine explained. "We raid them. Nobody gains anything. Nobody loses anything. We just trade corpses and pretend it matters. Been doing it for 7 years. We'll probably be doing it for 7 more unless someone important enough decides this world isn't worth the ammunition after all. There has to be a way to break the stalemate," I said. Castine looked at me with the expression of someone who'd heard that sentiment before and watched it die in the ash. You're the inspirational attachment, you tell me. I spent 3 days observing before I made my recommendation. 3 days watching soldiers who barely qualified as human anymore. Hollow-eyed, malnourished, some of them showing early signs of trench lung from inhaling ash for months on end. 3 days watching the daily casualty reports come in. 10 to 15 dead per day from snipers, disease, or simple despair manifesting as bullets through the brain. 3 days understanding that this wasn't war. It was systematic murder dressed in military terminology. On the 4th day, I requested a meeting with the regimental command staff. They assembled in what passed for a command bunker, a reinforced dugout that smelled like mold and desperation, lit by flickering lumens that cast everything in sickly yellow. Colonel Chenkov commanded the regiment, a Vostroyan with a beard that reached his chest and eyes that had seen too much to register surprise at anything. Exemplar, he greeted me, not bothering with formal military courtesy. You've seen the situation. You have recommendations, or are you just here to look inspirational while we die? I have a recommendation, I said. We negotiate. The silence that followed was profound. Explain, Chenkov said, his voice carefully neutral. The enemy position is identical to ours. They're dying at the same rate we are. They have the same supply problems, the same morale issues, the same strategic deadlock. We can't break them, they can't break us. So instead of continuing this pointless attrition, we open communications. Find out what they want. See if there's a way to resolve this without spending another 40 million lives. Major Castine made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. You want to negotiate with traitors. I want to stop wasting imperial resources on a war that can't be won through military means. This isn't heresy or cowardice. It's basic strategic logic. If we can neutralize this front through negotiation, we can redeploy these forces to theaters where they might actually make a difference. Chenkov stroked his beard, studying me with an expression I couldn't read. And if I agreed with you, he said slowly, and if I forwarded this recommendation up the chain of command, do you know what would happen? They'd evaluate the strategic merit. They'd execute me for cowardice in the face of the enemy, Chenkov interrupted. Then they'd execute you for suggesting negotiation with traitors. Then they'd execute every officer in this command bunker for listening to the suggestion without immediately reporting it as heresy. The Imperium doesn't negotiate with traitors, Exemplar. It kills them. That's the only strategic doctrine that matters. Even when killing them is impossible. Especially then. Because the moment we admit that some enemies can't be beaten, we admit that the Imperium isn't invincible. And that admission is more dangerous than any amount of material losses. He stood. The meeting clearly over. You're a symbol, Exemplar. Act like one. Lead a raid. Kill some traitors. Inspire the men to die with purpose instead of just dying. That's what you're here for. Not to think. We have commissars to handle that. I was dismissed, but as I left the bunker, Castine caught my arm. That was either very brave or very stupid, she said quietly. Probably both. But for what it's worth, you're right. This is pointless. We all know it's pointless. We just can't say it out loud. Why not? Because saying it would make us traitors too. They scheduled the raid for 3 nights later, a trench infiltration and enemy position harassment operation, which translated to crawl through no man's land in the dark, kill anyone you find, and try not to die yourself. I volunteered to lead it. Not because I believed it would accomplish anything, but because if I was going to condemn soldiers to pointless death, the least I could do was risk the same fate. We assembled at dusk, 20 volunteers from 4th Platoon, faces blackened with ash, lasguns checked and rechecked, combat knives sharpened on trench walls. They looked at me with expressions that ranged from desperate hope to exhausted resignation. "Listen," I told them, keeping my voice low. "This raid won't change anything. We'll kill a few of them, they'll kill a few of us. Tomorrow will be the same as yesterday. But Command needs to believe we're still fighting, still trying, still loyal. So we do this. We survive if we can. We make it count if we can't." Questions? A corporal raised his hand, barely 20 years old, with a fresh scar across his throat from a near-miss round. "Is it true what they say? That you're from before? That you remember when things were better?" The question hit me like a shock maul. "Yes," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty. "I remember something. A time when we didn't measure success in acceptable losses, when people had value beyond their utility, when—" I stopped, realizing what I was saying, realizing how dangerous those words were. "But that world is gone," I continued, recovering. "This is what we have now. So we survive it, that's all we can do." The corporal nodded, and I saw the light in his eyes dim just a little. I'd given him hope, then crushed it, just like the Imperium did every day. We went over the top at midnight. No man's land at night was a different kind of hell. The darkness was absolute except for occasional flares that lit the landscape in stuttering white light, casting shadows that moved like living things. We crawled on our bellies through ash and mud, past corpses so old they'd become part of the terrain. Through gaps in the razor wire that had been cut and repaired and cut again so many times the wire looked like silver scar tissue. The enemy trenches were 200 meters away. It took us 40 minutes to cross that distance, moving centimeter by centimeter, freezing whenever a flare went up, praying to an emperor who didn't listen that the sentries wouldn't spot us. We made it to within 10 meters before we were discovered. A sentry, just a kid, maybe 17, wearing Imperial Guard armor with the Aquila scratched out and replaced with a crude symbol I didn't recognize, spotted us and opened his mouth to shout. I killed him before he could make a sound. My combat knife took him in the throat, severing vocal cords and carotid simultaneously. He died with his eyes wide, looking at me with confusion rather than fear, as if he couldn't quite understand why someone wearing Imperial colors would be killing him in the dark. I understood the look, because he was wearing Imperial colors too, minus the Aquila. Same uniform, same equipment, same training. The only difference was the symbol on his chest and the decision his regiment had made 7 years ago. We dropped into their trench and found chaos. Soldiers scrambling for weapons, officers shouting contradictory orders, the general panic of a night raid executed successfully. My team moved with mechanical efficiency. Kill, move, kill again. We were Imperial Guard, and regardless of what else we might be, we were professionals at violence. I killed 6 soldiers in the first minute. The 7th stopped me. He didn't attack, didn't raise his weapon, just stood there in the flickering light of a dropped lumen looking at me with an expression of profound weariness. "Go ahead," he said. His accent was Cadian, or what remained of Cadian after their world died. "Make it quick if you can." I hesitated. The combat knife was already moving toward his throat, muscle memory executing the kill. But something made me pause. "Why aren't you fighting?" I asked. "Why bother?" he replied. "You'll kill me or I'll kill you, and tomorrow there'll be 20 more to replace whichever of us dies. Been doing this for 4 years. I'm tired, Exemplar." He knew who I was. The symbol, the inspiration, the weapon. "Then why did you become a traitor?" The word felt wrong in my mouth. "Traitor?" He laughed, and the sound was worse than screaming. "We didn't betray the Imperium. We just stopped believing it cared whether we lived or died. Our colonel questioned orders. Orders to charge across open ground against fortified positions for no strategic value. High command executed him for cowardice. Then they ordered us to do it anyway. 2,000 soldiers, 800 meters of open ground, heavy bolter emplacements. We lost 1,700 in 6 minutes. He met my eyes and I saw myself reflected there. The survivors asked why, he continued. Why throw away lives for nothing? Command said questioning orders was heresy. Said we should be grateful for the opportunity to die for the Emperor. So we left, crossed the lines, told the defenders we were done. They were Mordian, good soldiers, disciplined, but they understood. They'd been asking the same questions, so we joined them. Been fighting you ever since. Fighting for what? I asked. Survival. The right to die when it matters instead of when it's convenient for some Lord Commander who'll never set foot on this worthless planet. That's all. We're not chaos worshippers. We're not traitors to humanity. We're just done dying for an Imperium that treats us like ammunition. Behind me, I could hear my team finishing their killing. In minutes, we'd need to extract before their reinforcements arrived. But I stood there, knife in hand, looking at this man who could have been me in another timeline. You're still fighting, I pointed out. Still killing Imperial soldiers. How is that different? It's not, he admitted. That's the tragedy. We escaped the Imperium and just recreated it in miniature. Same trenches, same stalemate, same pointless death. Turns out we're exactly what the Imperium made us, weapons that only know how to kill. We can't even surrender properly. He closed his eyes. So go ahead, finish it. At least dying to you means something. You're a symbol. Makes for a better story than dying to some random Laz round in the dark. My hand moved. The knife stayed at my side. Run, I said quietly. There's an exit trench 30 meters east. My team is focused on the command dugout. You have maybe 2 minutes before they circle back. Run and don't stop. He stared at me, uncomprehending. Why? Because I'm tired too, I admitted. And killing you won't change anything. So run. Live one more day. Maybe that matters, maybe it doesn't. But I don't need another corpse on my conscience tonight. He ran. I turned back to my team and found Major Castine watching me from the trench entrance, her expression unreadable. Missed one, she said. He wasn't armed. Lying to me, Castine replied, and means you think I'm stupid enough to believe it. Lying to yourself means you haven't admitted what you just did. And what did I do? Showed mercy to a traitor, which makes you either the bravest or stupidest person I've ever met. Haven't decided which. She didn't report it, but we both knew the truth. I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. We extracted with 0 casualties, remarkably successful by the standards of trench raids. My team killed 18 enemy soldiers, destroyed a section of their communication equipment, and returned to tell inspirational stories about striking at the traitors who dared oppose the Emperor's will. The men cheered when we returned. I accepted their congratulations and said nothing about the soldier I'd let escape. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing his face, the exhaustion, the understanding, the mirror he'd held up showing me exactly what I was becoming. A weapon that only knew how to kill, trapped in a system that had turned survival into the only virtue and questioning into the highest sin. The traitors weren't corrupted by chaos. They were corrupted by the same thing corrupting me. The slow realization that the Imperium was a machine that consumed lives and produced nothing but more death. That serving it didn't lead to victory or justice or anything noble. Just more war. Forever. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake while my squad snored in exhausted sleep around me, was understanding that they were right. We were all ammunition. The only difference was whether we admitted it. The crack inside me had become a chasm so wide I could barely remember what used to bridge it. The ideals from before the ice, the belief that people deserved protection because they were people, not because they were strategically valuable, the conviction that there had to be a better way. all gone. Buried under 7 years of watching good soldiers die for bad reasons on a world that didn't matter in a war that couldn't be won. I thought about the deacon woman on sanctified Illyria pleading for mercy. I thought about the penal legionnaires executed after holding their line. I thought about 9 billion souls buried alive because the math favored it. And I thought about that Cadian soldier asking why he should bother fighting when tomorrow would bring 20 more just like me. He was right. They were all right. And I was the monster enforcing the system that made them right. The next morning, a Vox transmission arrived from regimental command. My inspirational attachment was concluded and I was being reassigned to a Penitent crusade, a suicide mission reserved for those who'd shown dangerous levels of independent thought and needed to be purified through violence. Interrogator Valdine's report from sanctified Illyria had finally caught up with me. I packed my gear without complaint and prepared for departure. Major Castine found me at the landing zone. "You could run," she said quietly. "Cross the lines like they did. The traitors would probably take you. You're valuable enough." "And then what?" I asked. "Recreate the same trenches on their side? Kill different people for different reasons that don't matter? There's nowhere to run to, Castine. The Imperium is everywhere. Even when you escape it, you bring it with you." She nodded, understanding. "Then die well, Exemplar. It's all any of us can hope for." The transport lifted off, carrying me toward whatever purification through violence looked like. I watched Kolos Tertius shrink in the viewport, that worthless world where 40 million had died and nothing had changed, and realized I'd finally learned the Imperium's ultimate lesson. There was no escape, no redemption, no victory, only service, until service killed you. And I was very good at service. The person I'd been before, the one who believed in justice and mercy and the value of human life, was finally completely dead. What remained was the Exemplar, and the Exemplar knew how to die for the Emperor. It was time to prove it. The Penitent Crusade assembled on a nameless moon orbiting a dying star. There was no official designation for this place, no catalog number, no imperial registry, just coordinates in a data slate and a ship that dropped us into the dark without ceremony or explanation. The moon's surface was barren rock scoured clean by solar radiation, and the only structure was a fortress monastery that looked like it had been grown rather than built, its walls organic and wrong in ways that made my enhanced vision ache. This was Hive Malefica, or what remained of it after the warp had touched it. "Exemplar." The chaplain who met us at the drop site was more machine than man, his lower body replaced entirely with tracked locomotion units, one arm a multi-barreled heavy bolter, his face hidden behind a skull-shaped helmet that wept sacred oils. His name was Grimaldus, or at least that's what the designation stenciled on his armor claimed. "You and your penitents have been blessed with the opportunity to cleanse this place. The Emperor's mercy is infinite, even for those who doubt." Behind me, my penitents assembled. 500 souls who'd committed the same sin I had, questioning, hesitating, showing mercy when efficiency was required. They wore penitent robes dyed red, their heads shaved, explosive collars locked around their necks. Most were guard soldiers who'd refused suicidal orders. Some were administratum workers who'd falsified reports to save civilian lives. A few were simply people who'd been in the wrong place when the ecclesiarchy needed bodies for a suicide mission. We were the condemned. This was our redemption. Or our grave. The Imperium didn't particularly care which. "What's in there?" I asked, gesturing to the fortress monastery. Up close, the wrongness was worse. The walls moved subtly breathing, and the stone had a texture like scar tissue. "Chaos cultists," Grimaldus replied. "Approximately 3,000, entrenched in the fortress's depths. They've been conducting rituals for 6 months, attempting to create a warp rift that would allow demon incursion. We cannot permit this. You will enter the fortress, kill everything that lives, and destroy the ritual chamber. No support, no extraction, no mercy. And if we succeed, then your sins are forgiven and you die with the Emperor's blessing rather than his disappointment. Grimaldus's skull helm tilted, servo motors whirring. If you fail, your souls are forfeit to the warp and your names are struck from Imperial records as if you never existed. These are the terms. I looked at my 500 penitents, exhausted, terrified, already mourning themselves, and felt nothing. The crack inside me had become a void. I was hollow, a weapon that pointed wherever it was aimed and killed whatever it was told to kill. We'll cleanse it, I said. The Emperor protects, Grimaldus intoned. He didn't offer us weapons, we were expected to take them from the dead. We entered Hive Malefica at dawn, though dawn on this moon meant only that the dying star's radiation increased from lethal to immediately fatal for unprotected flesh. The fortress entrance was a wound in reality, literally. The doorway looked like torn skin, the edges raw and weeping something that wasn't quite blood. Chaos corruption had transformed Imperial architecture into something from nightmares, and stepping through that entrance felt like being swallowed. The air inside was wrong. Too thick, too warm, tasting of copper and rotting flowers. The walls weren't stone anymore, but something that pulsed with an almost heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance I could hear chanting in languages that hurt to hear. Syllables that wanted to rearrange the listener's understanding of reality. Stay close, I told my penitents, my voice echoing strangely in the corrupted space. Watch for ambushes. Kill anything that moves. If someone starts hearing voices, report it immediately before the corruption spreads. We moved deeper into the fortress in a column formation that would have made any tactical instructor weep. But we had no choice. The corridors were narrow, twisted, designed by minds that had abandoned Euclidean geometry in favor of something more efficient at inducing madness. The first cultist we encountered was dead when we found him. He sat in what might have been a meditation chamber, his body fused to the floor, skin covered in symbols that moved when you weren't looking directly at them. His eyes were open, tracking our movement, but the body was long cold. Don't touch it, I warned as one of the penitents reached out. Chaos corruption lingers in the flesh. Even dead, they're dangerous. We moved past him and I heard his voice whisper in my mind. You cannot cleanse what has already welcomed us. This fortress is ours. We are legion. We are eternal. We are... I put a bolt round through his skull. The voice stopped. How did you... One of the penitents started to ask. I didn't want to hear the rest, I said, and kept moving. We found the first cache of weapons on level 2 in a room that had been an armory before corruption transformed it into something else. Lasguns hung on walls that bled. Grenades sat in crates that whispered promises. Combat knives were embedded in what looked like frozen screams given physical form. Take only what you need, I ordered. Touch nothing else. Chaos corrupts through desire. The more you want, the easier it claims you. The penitents armed themselves with the nervous efficiency of people who understood they were damned regardless and were simply choosing how they'd die. A few took extra ammunition. Most settled for a single weapon and prayers they whispered under their breath. We lost our first soldier on level 3. Her name was Yavena, former guard, court-martialed for refusing to execute civilians during a pacification operation. She'd been walking point when the corridor simply changed. One moment it was twisted but navigable. The next, the walls contracted like a throat swallowing and she was crushed between surfaces that had decided up and down were negotiable concepts. She didn't even have time to scream. We pried her body free, what remained of it, and kept moving. because that's what we did. That's all we knew how to do. The cultists found us on level 5. They came from everywhere and nowhere, emerging from walls that split open like wounds, dropping from ceilings that had grown mouths, rising from floors that had become pools of something that wasn't liquid but moved like it. They wore robes that were fused to their skin, and their faces had been replaced with symbols that hurt to perceive directly. And they were laughing, not the joyful laughter of orcs who loved violence. This was worse. The laughter of people who'd seen behind reality's curtain and found it hilarious that anyone still believed in concepts like hope or meaning or purpose. "Fire!" I roared, and my penitents opened up with las guns that painted the darkness in strobing red. The cultists died, but not easily. Las rounds punched through corrupted flesh, and they kept coming. Headshots that should have been instantly fatal just made them laugh harder. We had to destroy them completely, reduce them to component parts that could no longer function as a coherent whole. I waded into the center of their formation, shield raised, and began the grinding work of killing. My shield crushed skulls. My commandeered chainsword separated limbs. My enhanced body moved with mechanical precision, turning combat into a mathematical problem. Calculate trajectory. Apply force, confirm kill, move to next target. I killed 23 in the first 2 minutes. The cultists adapted. They stopped attacking individually and started flowing together, literally fusing their bodies into larger, more complex forms. 5 cultists became one creature with too many limbs and mouths where mouths shouldn't be. 10 became a writhing mass that tried to engulf us through sheer volume. "Fall back," I ordered, and we retreated down the corridor while maintaining fire. "Grenades! Aim for the fusion points!" The penitents obeyed with the desperate precision of people who understood this was their only chance. Frag grenades arced through the corrupted air and detonated among the cultists, ripping apart the fusion points where individual bodies had merged into collective nightmares. The cultists screamed, not in pain, but in frustration that we'd discovered a tactical weakness. We killed them all. It took 40 minutes and cost us 37 soldiers, but we killed them. In the silence that followed, I realized I was breathing hard, not from exertion, but from something deeper. Fear, maybe. Or the recognition that we were fighting an enemy that didn't follow rules, that had abandoned the basic principles of reality, and that every victory was just delaying the inevitable. "How many levels?" asked Sergeant Drax, a former Cadian who'd been condemned for the same crime as the soldier I'd spared on Kolos Tertius. "How deep does this go?" I checked the data slate Grimaldus had provided. The fortress had 17 levels. We were on level 5. "We keep going," I said, "because what else could we do?" Levels 6 through 10 were a blur of violence and madness. We fought cultists who'd replaced their eyes with warp sight and could predict our movements. We navigated corridors that led in directions that didn't exist. We lost soldiers to traps that violated causality, mines that exploded before they were triggered, blades that cut before they swung, deaths that happened in the wrong order. By level 11, we'd lost 216 penitents. The survivors were hollow-eyed, moving on autopilot, so deep in trauma that fear had become just another background sensation like hunger or cold. We'd stopped bothering with names or ranks. We were just bodies that still moved, weapons that still fired, doing what we were told because the alternative was lying down and letting the madness take us. I wondered if that would be worse. On level 12, we found the ritual chamber. It was vast, impossibly so, larger than the fortress's exterior dimensions should have permitted. The ceiling disappeared into darkness that felt alive. The floor was marked with symbols drawn in what looked like congealed starlight. And in the center, surrounded by chanting cultists who'd long ago stopped being human, was the ritual. I couldn't look at it directly. My enhanced vision simply refused to process what it was seeing. I caught glimpses, angles that shouldn't connect, colors that didn't exist in normal space, geometries that made my brain ache trying to comprehend them. This was the warp rift they'd been trying to create, not open yet, but close. So close. That's it, Drax whispered beside me. That's what we came to destroy. Around the ritual, I counted approximately 1,000 cultists. They'd abandoned individual forms entirely and existed as a single writhing mass of flesh and prayer and focused will. They were trying to tear a hole in reality through sheer faith in powers that lived in the spaces between thoughts. We were 284 soldiers with stolen weapons and explosive collars. The mathematics were not in our favor. We can't fight that, Drax said, and it wasn't cowardice, just observation. No, I agreed, and we can't. I looked at my remaining penitents, these souls who'd been condemned for the crime of being human, of showing mercy, of questioning orders that deserved questioning. They'd followed me this far. They'd killed and died and descended into this hell because the Imperium had given them no choice. And I realized I could give them one now. Listen, I said, my enhanced voice cutting through the chanting. The Imperium sent us here to die. They called it redemption, but it was just disposal. We're inconvenient questions made flesh, and they wanted us erased. The penitents watched me with expressions I couldn't read. I'm going to destroy that ritual, I continued. I'm going to charge into that mass of cultists, detonate my collar's power cell manually, and hope the explosion disrupts whatever they're building. It probably won't work. But if it does, you'll have maybe 5 minutes to reach the surface before this place collapses. I reached up and manually disengaged the safeties on my collar. The device began emitting a warning tone, a countdown to detonation that couldn't be stopped now. You don't have to follow me, I said. Your collars can be disabled if you move fast enough. Run. Scatter. Find a way off this moon. The Imperium thinks you're already dead. Let them keep thinking it. Live. That's an order. Silence. Then Sergeant Drax stepped forward and disengaged his own collar's safeties. Lived too long as a coward, he said. Rather die doing something that matters. One by one, the remaining penitents followed. 284 warning tones filled the corrupted air, overlapping into a single sustained scream. We had approximately 4 minutes. Then we run, I said, and charged. The final assault was less a battle and more a sustained act of suicide. We hit the cultist mass like a meteor strike. 284 soldiers with nothing left to lose and less than 4 minutes to live. We fired until our last guns overheated and exploded in our hands. We detonated grenades at point-blank range. We used our own bodies as weapons, crashing into the ritual circle with the force of absolute conviction. The cultists screamed, not in their mouths but in the warp itself, a sound that existed in dimensions I couldn't perceive. The ritual wavered. I reached the center, the exact geometric heart of their working, and saw it clearly for the first time. Not a rift yet, but a thinning. A place where reality had worn so thin that something on the other side was pressing through. I could see eyes, too many eyes, watching, waiting, hungry. Not today, I said to whatever was watching. My collar reached 0. The explosion was silent, or maybe I just couldn't hear it over the sound of reality itself screaming. The shockwave ripped through the ritual chamber like the Emperor's own judgment, disrupting the symbols, scattering the cultists, shattering the thinned space where something had been trying to push through. The warp rift collapsed in on itself with a sound like a door slamming shut across the galaxy. The fortress began to come apart. I was still alive, somehow. My enhanced body had survived the collar detonation, though I could feel bones broken in places I didn't know bones existed. Around me, pieces of my penitents littered the chamber. They'd succeeded. They'd died. They'd mattered. The ceiling was collapsing. The walls were screaming. The floor was opening into voids that led nowhere. I tried to stand and failed. Tried again and managed to get to my knees. The chamber was coming apart, reality reasserting itself violently, purging the corruption through the simple expedient of ceasing to exist. I was going to die here, crushed under tons of stone, or consumed by the void, or simply erased when the fortress decided it couldn't sustain its own existence anymore. And I found I didn't mind. I'd spent so long being the Imperium's weapon, its symbol, its executioner. So long watching good people die for bad reasons. So long grinding myself away until nothing remained but the function I served. But here at the end, I'd made a choice. I'd given my penitents an option I'd never been given. I'd stood against the powers that waited in the dark and said, "Not today." It wasn't redemption, but it was something. The ceiling fell and I closed my eyes, and I woke up 6 weeks later in a medical facility I didn't recognize. The chirurgeon standing over me was more machine than man, his augmetic eyes clicking as they focused on my face. "Subject designate Sigma 7, he said, consulting a data slate. "The Exemplar. You were recovered from the ruins of Hive Malefica by salvage teams. You should not be alive. Your injuries were catastrophic. We had to replace approximately 40% of your musculature, reinforce your skeletal structure with adamantium plating, and install a secondary heart to compensate for the damage to your primary cardiovascular system." "The others?" I asked, my voice raw. "The penitents?" "No other survivors recovered. You were the only one the salvage teams deemed worth the resources to extract." Of course, I was valuable, a symbol, worth the investment. The penitents who'd followed me into hell, just bodies left to rot. "The ritual?" I tried again. "Destroyed. The warp rift never manifested. Hive Malefica has been designated for exterminatus and will be sterilized within the month. The Inquisition considers the Crusade a success." The chirurgeon's mechanical face approximated what might have been satisfaction. "You will be commended, possibly even promoted. The Imperium rewards those who serve with distinction." He walked away, leaving me alone with machines that beeped and whirred, monitoring a body that was less flesh and more weapon with each passing year. I'd destroyed the ritual. I'd stopped the demon incursion. I'd done everything the Imperium had asked, and I'd learned absolutely nothing. Because here I was, still alive, still serving, still being pointed at problems and expected to kill them. The penitents had earned death. I'd earned more service. The void inside me, where ideals and hope and humanity used to be, echoed with a single terrible truth. The Imperium didn't want me dead. It wanted me useful. And I was very, very useful. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but all I could see were the faces of 284 penitents who'd followed me into hell because I'd told them it mattered. It hadn't. Nothing mattered. Only service. Only war. Forever. They shipped me to Terra, the throne world. Humanity's cradle and capital, the single most important planet in an imperium spanning 1,000,000 worlds. I'd heard of it, of course. Every imperial citizen knew of Terra, spoke of it in hushed tones, dreamed of pilgrimage, though most would never afford the cost or survive the journey. I was being given an audience. The transport that carried me was different from the usual guard vessels. Cleaner, more ornate. Its corridors lined with devotional texts and purity seals that dated back millennia. The other passengers were high-ranking ecclesiarchy officials, administratum lords whose decisions affected billions, and Astartes from chapters I didn't recognize, whose armor bore honors that predated my birth by centuries. None of them spoke to me. I was a curiosity, an anomaly. The Exemplar, the soldier from before, recovered from the ice, remade into a symbol the Imperium could parade before dying regiments. Worth an audience with Terra's religious authorities, but not worth conversation. I spent the 3-month journey in my assigned quarters, alone with my thoughts and the machines that kept my reconstructed body functioning. They weren't good company, neither the thoughts nor the machines. Terra filled the viewport like a promise and a lie. The planet should have been beautiful, humanity's birthworld, the cradle of civilization, the place where it all began. Instead, it was the most densely populated, heavily polluted, and architecturally confused world I'd ever seen. Hive cities covered every square meter of surface, stacked so high they breached the atmosphere. The oceans had been drained or paved over millennia ago. The natural landscape was buried under so many layers of construction that people argued about whether mountains or oceans had existed in the first place. 25 quadrillion souls lived here. The number was incomprehensible, so large that individual lives became rounding errors in administrative calculations. And somewhere at the heart of it all, buried in a palace the size of continents, sat the Emperor. The God Emperor of mankind, the master of humanity, the corpse god sustained by 10,000 psychic sacrifices daily. Sitting on his golden throne for 10,000 years, holding back the tides of chaos through sheer will and the Astronomican's light. I was going to be brought into his presence, or as close as someone like me could get. The palace was larger than worlds. That wasn't hyperbole. The imperial palace sprawled across the entire northern continent, its walls reaching into space, its foundations burrowing through Terra's crust into the mantle itself. We entered through the Eternity Gate, a portal so vast that Titans could march through in formation, and began the descent into the palace's depths. Down through layers of history written in architecture, down through sections built during the Unification Wars, through chambers from the Great Crusade, through corridors added during the Horus Heresy, through the endless additions and modifications of 10,000 years of desperate survival. My guide was a custodian, one of the Emperor's personal guardians, towering figures in golden armor who made Astartes look like children. He didn't speak to me, simply gestured for me to follow as we descended through security checkpoints that could have stopped armies, past servitor stations monitoring threats I couldn't comprehend, into the sacred heart of the Imperium. The throne room. We didn't enter it, couldn't. Only the highest lords of the Imperium could physically approach the Golden Throne, and even they had to be extensively prepared and purified first. Instead, my guide led me to an antechamber. A vast space lined with statues of heroes from ages past, their names long forgotten but their service immortalized in stone. "Wait here," the custodian said. His voice was deep enough to feel in my chest. "The chaplain will address you shortly." He left, his golden armor disappearing into shadows that felt heavier than normal darkness. I waited, and waiting in that space, surrounded by statues of forgotten heroes, knowing I was separated from the Emperor by perhaps a kilometer of sacred stone, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Fragile, foolish hope that maybe being this close to Terra's heart, to the source of everything the Imperium claimed to be, I might find answers. Might understand why the grinding horror was necessary. Might discover that beneath the bureaucracy and brutality and endless war there was actually purpose, meaning, something worth the oceans of blood we'd spilled. The chaplain arrived an hour later. He was ancient, probably 300 years old, kept alive through augmetics and faith in equal measure. His armor was ceremony rather than function, covered in purity seals and devotional texts written in High Gothic so old I couldn't read them. His face was mostly hidden behind a rebreather mask, but his eyes were sharp and clear, missing nothing. "Exemplar," he greeted me, his voice processed through vox grills to sound like a choir. "I am Chaplain Absalom, keeper of the Monument Chamber, guardian of service records dating to the Unification. You have been granted this audience as recognition of your service. The Imperium values those who serve without question." "I've had questions," I admitted, "and yet you served anyway. That is what matters." Absalom gestured for me to follow, leading me deeper into the antechamber. "Do you know why you were brought here?" "No. Because your existence poses theological problems." He said it matter-of-factly, as if discussing inventory discrepancies. "You remember a time before the Emperor, before the Imperium. Your memories, fragmented though they are, suggest a human civilization that functioned without his guidance. This is concerning." "Concerning how?" "The Imperial Creed teaches that humanity without the Emperor is humanity doomed to extinction. That only through his guidance, his sacrifice, his eternal vigilance do we survive. But you suggest otherwise. You suggest humanity once thrived without him. This creates doubt." We stopped before a massive door carved from a single piece of stone, its surface covered in names. Billions of names. Maybe trillions. "Do you know what this is?" Absalom asked. "No. The Monument to the Forgotten. Every name carved here represents an Imperial servant whose sacrifice prevented some small disaster. A guard soldier who held a trench, an administratum clerk who caught a corruption investigation before it spread, a navigator who got their ship through the warp despite impossible odds. Billions upon billions of forgotten heroes whose names are recorded here because someone somewhere wanted to remember that they mattered." He traced his augmetic fingers across names too small to read individually. "The Imperium," Absalom continued, "survives because of these forgotten sacrifices. Not because of grand heroes or mighty warriors, but because billions of ordinary humans do their duty knowing they'll never be remembered, never be rewarded, but never receive anything except the Emperor's questionable protection." "That's not inspiring," I said. "That's horrifying." "Yes," Absalom agreed. "It is. But it's also truth. The Imperium is not a grand civilization reaching for enlightenment. We're a species in triage, making terrible choices because the alternatives are worse. We're bleeding out, and we've been bleeding out for 10,000 years, and the only thing keeping us alive is that we're willing to sacrifice anything, everything, for one more day of survival." He turned to face me fully. "You want to know why the horror is necessary? Why we kill civilians who question food distribution? Why we execute soldiers for showing mercy? Why we grind through 40 million lives on worthless worlds? Why we turn humans into servitors and measure success in acceptable losses? Yes. Because the alternative is extinction." Absalom's voice carried absolute conviction. "Not defeat, not subjugation, extinction. Humanity erased from the galaxy as if we never existed. That is what waits in the dark. The Tyranids that devour worlds, the Necrons that treat us as vermin, the Eldari that view us as barely evolved apes, and worst of all, chaos. The powers in the warp that would turn humanity into playthings and call it mercy." He gestured to the Monument of the Forgotten. "Every name here is someone who understood this truth and served anyway, not because they believed the Imperium was good or just or right, but because they believed extinction was worse. That's the Emperor's lesson, Exemplar. That's the final truth you came here to learn." "There's nothing else?" I asked, and hated the desperation in my voice. "No hope of improvement? No chance we might build something better?" "No," Absalom said softly. "We had our chance. We had 10,000 years of brilliance under the Emperor's direct guidance during the Great Crusade. We conquered the galaxy. We reached for the stars with both hands and made them ours. And we failed. We betrayed ourselves. Half the legions turned traitor. The Emperor was placed on the throne, and everything since then has been managed decline. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that should have been comforting but felt like a death sentence. "You were right to question," he continued. "You were right to show mercy. You were right to want something better. But this galaxy doesn't care about right. It cares about survival. And the Imperium, monstrous, brutal, inefficient as it is the only thing keeping humanity from the void. So we just endure? Forever? We just accept that this grinding horror is all we get?" "Yes," Absalom said, "we accept it, we serve it, we die for it. Because the alternative is worse. That is the Emperor's final lesson. That is why we fight." He led me to a viewport that looked down into the palace's depths. In the distance, barely visible through layers of sacred architecture, I could see a golden glow. The Astronomicon, the light by which all ships navigated the warp. The psychic beacon powered by the Emperor's will and the souls of 10,000 psychers sacrificed daily to sustain it. 10,000 souls, every day, for 10,000 years. 100 billion sacrifices to keep the light burning. "Look at it," Absalom commanded. "That light is all that keeps humanity connected across the stars. If it goes out, every human world becomes isolated. The Imperium fragments. Chaos wins. We go extinct. Those 10,000 daily sacrifices, they're volunteers, did you know that? Psychers from across the Imperium who understand what's at stake and walk willingly into death so others might live." I stared at the golden glow and felt something inside me break. Not the crack or the chasm. Something deeper. The last foundation. The final piece of whoever I'd been before. "The Imperium," I said slowly, "is a system designed to survive at any cost. It doesn't matter if we're good or evil, just or unjust, merciful or cruel. All that matters is that we persist. One more day, one more year, one more millennium. Even if we become monsters in the process." "Now you understand," Absalom replied. They gave me a medal after the audience, the Star of Terra, one of the highest honors the Imperium could bestow. They pinned it to my armor in a ceremony attended by lords of the administratum and ecclesiarchy officials who smiled and congratulated me and never once asked if I wanted the honor. I accepted it with the appropriate humility. I said the right words about duty and service and the Emperor's protection. I played my role as the exemplar, the symbol, the inspiration. And inside, in the void where my soul used to be, I finally understood what I'd become. The Imperium hadn't broken me through torture or conditioning or chemical manipulation. It had broken me by showing me the truth. That in a galaxy of infinite horror, the only sin was stopping. The only heresy was surrender. The only failure was questioning whether endless war might not be the answer. I'd been right to show mercy on Kolos Tertius. I'd been right to question the massacre on sanctified Illyria. I'd been right to offer my penitents a choice in Hive Malefica. But being right didn't matter, because right and wrong were luxuries humanity couldn't afford. We could only survive, and I, whatever I'd been before the ice, was now completely, perfectly, irreversibly a tool of that survival. They shipped me out the next day, back to the wars, back to the grinding fronts where guard regiments died by the millions for kilometers of worthless terrain. Back to being the Exemplar, the symbol they wheeled out when morale collapsed and soldiers needed reminding that their deaths served a purpose. As Terra shrank in the viewport, I thought about the monument of the forgotten, those trillions of names representing service that had mattered just enough to be recorded and not enough to be remembered. I would never be on that monument. I was too valuable, too symbolic, too useful as inspiration. I would be remembered. My name, whatever it had been before Sigma 7, before the Exemplar, would be recorded in history as a footnote about a soldier from before who learned to serve the Imperium properly. And somewhere in whatever remained of my consciousness, the person I'd been screamed. But screaming changed nothing. The Imperium ground on. I ground on with it. The Emperor protects, he doesn't. But we pretend he does. Because the alternative is admitting we're alone in the dark with monsters we can't defeat. So we make our sacrifices, we spend our ammunition. We survive one more day. That's all we've ever been able to do. That's all we'll ever be able to do, until the stars burn cold and humanity finally joins the monument of the forgotten. I no longer dream of ice. That's the first thing I notice when I wake, if what I do can still be called waking. My augmetics pull me from something that isn't quite sleep into something that isn't quite consciousness. A transition measured in microseconds and accompanied by diagnostic readouts I've learned to interpret without thinking. All systems nominal. Combat effectiveness 97.3%. Biological components 31% and declining. I've been fighting for 214 years. The number should mean something. Should feel significant, but numbers stopped having emotional weight somewhere around year 50, after I'd killed my 10 millionth enemy and realized I'd stopped counting individual faces decades earlier. I am chapter master of the Obsidian Shields now, a title the Departamento Munitorum created for me approximately 160 years ago when they decided that Exemplar wasn't impressive enough for the propaganda reels. They built an entire chapter around me. Not Astartes. The Adeptus Astartes would never accept someone of uncertain origin into their ranks. But something adjacent. Elite guard formations with enhanced augmetics, trained to fight with the efficiency of space marines and die with the expendability of regular humans. The best of both, from the Imperium's perspective. I've commanded 17 different formations of obsidian shields, each one numbered approximately 1,000 soldiers. Each one carefully selected, extensively augmented, trained to perfection. Each one dead. 17,000 enhanced soldiers ground to dust across 2 centuries of warfare while I persist. The constants in the equation. The weapon that cannot be allowed to break because too much propaganda value has been invested in keeping it functional. My flagship, the Eternal Vigil, orbits a planet I don't remember the name of. That's not unusual anymore. The planets blur together after the first 100. Hive worlds, Forge worlds, Shrine worlds, Death worlds, worlds that have no classification except contested and strategically irrelevant, but symbolically important. I've fought on all of them, killed on all of them, watched good soldiers die on all of them. The current world is... I check the tactical display. Mordax Prime. Industrial world. Population 14 billion, currently under assault by a chaos warband calling itself the Crimson Apostles. They've corrupted 3 of the 7 primary Hive cities and are broadcasting heresies that the Inquisition finds particularly dangerous. My orders are simple. Drop, kill, extract, repeat until the heresy is cleansed or the planet is deemed unsalvageable and marked for exterminatus. I've done this so many times I could write the after-action report before the battle begins. Chapter Master. The voice belongs to Captain Matthias, my second in command and the closest thing I have to a friend, though friendship is a concept that feels increasingly abstract. He's been with the Obsidian Shields for 6 years, practically a veteran by our standards. The 18th is assembled and ready for deployment, awaiting your orders. The 18th, the 18th formation of obsidian shields I've commanded. The 17th died on Balhaut Secundus, holding a supply depot against orc raiders for 3 days after our extraction transport was destroyed. 47 survivors out of 1,000. The Departamento Munitorum called it a heroic last stand. I called it poor logistics planning. Status of the target zone, I ask, though I already know the answer from the tactical displays integrated into my augmetic optical implants. Hive Tertius is fully corrupted. Estimated enemy strength, 30,000 cultists, plus whatever demon spawn they've managed to manifest. Intelligence suggests the warband sorcerer is attempting a summoning ritual in the primary cathedral. If successful, we could be facing a greater demon incursion. A greater demon. 200 years ago, that phrase would have meant something. Fear, perhaps. Respect for the magnitude of the threat. Now it's just another data point. Another enemy type with documented weaknesses and recommended engagement protocols. Deployment in 30 minutes, I say. Full company strength. We drop directly onto the cathedral district and kill everything between us and the sorcerer. Collateral damage is acceptable. The Hive is already lost. Focus on speed over preservation. Understood, Chapter Master. Matthias hesitates. Sir, if I may, you seem distracted. Distracted. The word almost makes me laugh, though I haven't laughed in perhaps 80 years. How do I explain to Matthias, who's only been alive for 32 years, that distraction is impossible when you've done the same thing so many times that it's become muscle memory writ large? That I could command this assault in my sleep if I still slept properly? I'm operational, I say instead. Dismissed. He leaves and I'm alone with the tactical displays and the machines that keep my reconstructed body functioning in the crushing weight of 2 centuries. I look at my reflection in the polished surface of my armor, ceramite painted in the obsidian shield's colors, black and silver covered in purity seals and honors I don't remember earning. The face looking back is barely recognizable as human. Augmetic implants cover most of the skull. One eye has been replaced with a targeting system that gives me 340-degree vision. My jaw is reinforced adamantium after a Tyranid warrior's talon shattered the original. I try to remember what I looked like before the ice, before the Imperium, before 200 years of reconstruction turned me into more machine than man. I can't. The memory is gone. If it ever existed. Filed away in neural architecture that's been overwritten so many times with tactical data and kill metrics and after-action reports that there's no room left for anything as frivolous as personal history. I am the Exemplar, the weapon eternal, the symbol the Imperium parades before dying regiments to convince them that service without end is not only possible but glorious, and I am so very, very tired. The drop is textbook perfect. 1,000 obsidian shields and Mark 7 power armor, not quite Astartes grade but close enough, descending on screaming jump packs into a hive city that's been transformed into a monument to chaos. The cathedral district is a nightmare of corrupted architecture, buildings that bleed, streets paved with something that used to be human, and symbols that hurt to look at directly even through my augmetic filters. We land in formation, shields locked, weapons hot, and begin the systematic extermination of everything that opposes us. I've done this so many times. My shield, the same design as the one they gave me on my first deployment, replaced and repaired countless times but fundamentally unchanged, crushes cultist skulls with mechanical precision. My power sword, a weapon I acquired somewhere around year 70, carves through corrupted flesh with the efficiency of 2 centuries of practice. My enhanced body moves through the combat space like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance toward maximum lethality. Behind me, the obsidian shields advance in perfect formation. They fight like I taught them to fight, efficiently, brutally, without hesitation or mercy. They are perfect soldiers, perfect weapons. They will all be dead within 5 years. That's the average lifespan of an obsidian shield. 5 years from recruitment to death. Some last longer, most last less. But they all die eventually, ground down by the endless wars while I persist. I've stopped learning their names. We reach the cathedral in 4 hours. The building is a perversion of imperial architecture. What was once a monument to the emperor has been transformed into something that makes my augmetic threat assessment system scream warnings. The walls pulse with warp energy. The stained glass windows show scenes from nightmares given form, and from somewhere deep inside I can hear chanting in languages that predate human civilization. Breaching charges, I order, and my shields move with practiced efficiency. The doors blow inward in a shower of corrupted stone and warp fire. We advance through the smoke, weapons tracking for targets, and find ourselves in hell. The cathedral's interior has been completely transformed. The floor is no longer stone, but something organic, pulsing like infected flesh. The ceiling has been replaced with a view into the warp itself, raw chaos given visual form, impossible colors and geometries that my enhanced mind struggles to process. And in the center, surrounded by chanting cultists and demon spawn that shouldn't exist in real space, is the sorcerer. He's massive, easily 3 meters tall, wrapped in armor that seems to be fused to his flesh. His face is hidden behind a helmet carved from what might be bone, and when he speaks, his voice comes from everywhere and nowhere. The Exemplar, he says, and the word echoes in dimensions I can't perceive. The weapon eternal, the symbol of the corpse emperor's grinding war machine. How perfect that you should be here for my ascension. Kill him, I order, and the obsidian shields open fire, last fire, bolt rounds, plasma blasts. Everything we have converges on the sorcerer's position. The cultists around him are annihilated instantly, reduced to component atoms by the sheer volume of fire. But the sorcerer himself stands untouched, protected by a barrier of warp energy that turns our weapons into light shows. You cannot stop this, he says, gesturing to the ritual circle carved into the cathedral floor. The veil is thin here. The Prince of Pleasure has heard my prayers. In moments, a greater demon will manifest, and this world will become a paradise of sensation, and I stop listening. I've heard this speech before. Different words, different chaos gods, different sorcerers, but always the same underlying message. We're winning. You're losing. The Imperium's days are numbered. 200 years of the same speech. I charge. My enhanced body crosses the distance in 3.7 seconds. I know because my augmetics time everything, reducing combat to mathematics. The sorcerer's barrier flares as I impact it, warp energy meeting the consecrated ceramite of my shield. And for a moment, we're locked in a contest of competing impossibilities. Then I do something the sorcerer doesn't expect. I stop fighting the barrier and instead push through it, accepting the warp fire that sears through my armor and burns the biological components of my body. Because pain is just another form of damage, and damage can be repaired, and this needs to end. My sword finds his throat. The sorcerer makes a sound of surprise, almost comical, as if he genuinely didn't expect someone to simply endure the warp fire and kill him anyway. His barrier collapses, his body falls, and the ritual, incomplete, implodes with a sound like reality sighing in relief. The demon that was trying to manifest gets pulled back into the warp, screaming its frustration across dimensions. The cathedral shudders and begins to collapse, the corrupted architecture unable to sustain itself without the sorcerer's will holding it together. Withdraw, I order, and the obsidian shields retreat in perfect formation, while the building comes apart around us. We emerge into weak sunlight filtering through Mordak's Prime's polluted atmosphere. Behind us, the cathedral collapses into rubble. Around us, the corrupted Hive city is already beginning to die, the chaos influence fading without the sorcerer to sustain it. Another victory, another world saved, another battle added to the tally that stopped meaning anything somewhere around the 10,000 mark. Captain Matthias approaches, his armor scorched but intact. Chapter Master, casualty report, 47 dead, 112 wounded but combat effective. The enemy is routed, Mordak's Prime is secure. 47 dead. 47 soldiers whose names I won't remember, who died following my orders, who will be replaced by the next batch of recruits the Departamento Munitorum ships to the Obsidian Shields. Acceptable losses, I hear myself say, and the words taste like ashes. Matthias hesitates. Sir, are you well? Your biosigns are showing elevated stress indicators. I'm operational, I say again. It's my standard response, my only response. Because what else is there to say? The debriefing takes place aboard the Eternal Vigil 3 days later. An Inquisitor has been dispatched to review our performance, a woman named Covenant, whose augmetic modifications make her look more like a servo skull than a human. She reviews the tactical recordings with the detached interest of someone analyzing a manufacturing process. Exemplary work, as always, she says, and I'm still not sure if anyone realizes they're making that pun. Mordak's Prime has been returned to Imperial compliance. The corrupted hives will be demolished and rebuilt. Estimated timeline for full productivity restoration, 23 years. The Emperor is pleased. The Emperor, I say before I can stop myself, is a corpse on a throne who hasn't been pleased about anything in 10,000 years. The words hang in the recycled air like a death sentence. Covenant's augmetic eyes focus on me with the intensity of targeting lasers. Chapter Master, that statement borders on heresy. Does it? I'm surprised by how calm my voice is. I've fought for 214 years. I've killed millions in the Emperor's name. I've watched entire civilizations burn because the Administratum calculated that their continued existence was more expensive than their extermination. And in all that time, in all those battles, I've never once felt the Emperor's presence, never once received guidance or blessing or anything except silence. The Emperor's will manifests through us, I interrupt. Through soldiers who die by the billions, through civilians ground into servitors, through children conscripted at 10 and dead by 20. The Emperor doesn't protect, Inquisitor. We protect. We kill, we die, and we call it his will because admitting that we're alone is more terrifying than any demon in the warp. Covenant stands, her hand moving toward the bolt pistol at her hip. Chapter Master, you are dangerously close to what? I ask. Execution? Please, I've been trying to die for a century. The Imperium won't let me. I'm too valuable, too symbolic, so instead they keep repairing me, keep sending me to wars, keep using me as proof that service without end is not only possible but glorious. I gesture to my augmetic body. 31% biological, 69% machine, held together by the Mechanicus's finest work and the Imperium's desperate need for symbols. I am what the Imperium makes of its heroes, Inquisitor. I am the logical endpoint of eternal service. A weapon that cannot be allowed to break because too much has been invested in maintaining it. I don't sleep. I don't dream. I barely remember what it means to be human. I am function without purpose, duty without meaning, service without end. And yet you serve, Covenant says softly. Yes, I admit, because there's nothing else, because stopping would mean admitting that the last 200 years were meaningless. Because the alternative, watching the Imperium fall, watching humanity go extinct, is worse than persisting in this grinding horror. I meet her augmetic gaze with my own. I learned the Emperor's final lesson on Terra, Inquisitor. I learned that right and wrong don't matter, that justice and mercy are luxuries we can't afford, that all that matters is survival, purchased with oceans of blood and mountains of corpses, one more day at a time until the stars burn cold. And, she prompts. And I hate it, I whisper. I hate every moment of it. I hate what I've become. I hate what the Imperium has made me, but I'll keep serving because that's what I am now. Not a person, not even really a soldier, just a weapon. The weapon eternal. Pointed at problems until I finally break or the Imperium runs out of wars to send me to. Silence. Covenant studies me for a long moment, then holsters her bolt pistol. Your honesty, she says carefully, is refreshing. Most chapter masters lie to themselves, convince themselves that the glory and honor mean something. You at least understand the truth. Does that make it better or worse? Neither. It simply makes you useful in different ways. She produces a data slate. You're being redeployed. The Tertian sector is collapsing under Tyranid assault. They need symbols. They need heroes. They need someone who can stand in front of billions of doomed souls and convince them that dying slowly is better than dying quickly. Another war, another sector, another billion corpses with my name in the casualty report's footnotes. When do I leave? I ask. Tomorrow. Understood. Covenant pauses at the door. Chapter Master, does it help? Knowing that your service, meaningless as it feels, actually does delay the inevitable? That every world you save is a few more years of human existence? I consider the question. 214 years of experience. 17 formations of obsidian shields, millions of confirmed kills, hundreds of worlds saved, at least temporarily. Does it help? No, I answer honestly. But I do it anyway. She nods and leaves. I stand alone in my chambers, if a room filled with tactical displays and weapon racks and augmetic maintenance equipment can be called chambers, and look at the one personal item I've kept across 2 centuries. It's a piece of ice. Just a small fragment, kept in a stasis field, recovered from the vessel where they found me. The only physical connection to whoever I was before. I stare at it and try to remember. Try to recall the person who existed before the Imperium reshaped him into a weapon. The man who believed in justice and mercy and the value of human life. The soldier who thought wars should be won with minimal casualties, who saw civilians as people to protect rather than resources to expend. That person is dead. He died in pieces across 200 years. In the Schola Progenium's indoctrination chambers. On Hive Arthemis's killing floors. In sanctified Illyria's massacre. On Kolos Tertius's pointless trenches. In Hive Malefica's corrupted depths. On Terra itself learning the final lesson. And what remains is this. A consciousness trapped in an augmetic shell. Piloting a body that's more machine than flesh, serving an Imperium that's more grinding engine than civilization, fighting wars that can't be won against enemies that can't be defeated, for a species that's slowly going extinct despite every sacrifice. I am the Exemplar, the weapon eternal, the symbol they parade before the dying to convince them that their deaths have meaning. And somewhere, in whatever remains of my original neural patterns, the person I was still screams. But screaming changes nothing. The Imperium grinds on. I grind on with it. Tomorrow I'll deploy to the Tertian sector. I'll fight the Tyranids with the same efficiency I've fought every other enemy. I'll watch my 18th formation of obsidian shields die with the same detachment I've watched the previous 17. I'll file the after-action reports and accept the commendations and stand before the next generation of doomed soldiers and convince them that dying for the Emperor matters. I'll lie because that's what weapons do. They function as designed, and I was designed to be eternal. The transport lifts off at dawn. As my flagship breaks orbit, I watch Mordak's Prime shrink in the viewport. Another world saved, another temporary victory in an unwinnable war. And I think about the monument of the forgotten on Terra. Trillions of names, trillions of servants who died in obscurity. Their sacrifices noted but not remembered. Their service acknowledged but not honored. I will never be on that monument. I am too valuable to be forgotten. My name, whatever it was, whoever I was, will be recorded in the Imperium's histories as a footnote about a soldier from before who learned to serve properly, who became the perfect weapon, who fought for 200 years and never once stopped, never once broke, never once allowed himself the mercy of final death. Future generations will hear about the Exemplar and think how glorious, how inspiring, how noble to serve so long and so faithfully. They won't know about the void inside me, the screaming, the hatred of what I've become. They'll just see the symbol, and that symbol will inspire them to die in their turn, grinding themselves down in service to an Imperium that measures their worth in ammunition expenditure and casualty ratios. The cycle continues, forever, until the stars burn cold, until humanity finally joins the forgotten, until there's nothing left but silence in the dark. The Emperor protects, they tell me. He doesn't, he never did. There is no Emperor, there is no protection, there is only war. And I am its weapon, eternal, unbreaking, empty. In the grim darkness of the far future there is only war, and I am what war makes of its servants, forever.